Hello, I'm Dan, and welcome to the Sleep Guidance, where today's journey begins with a grim but fascinating truth. During one 19th century cholera outbreak, entire families survived simply because they lived inside a workhouse that, by pure accident, had its own separate water supply. Before we dive into the real stories of how ordinary people faced a disease that killed within hours, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below when and where you're listening from. If you lived in the 1800s, mornings were dangerous things, not because of thieves or fires or political uprisings, but because they lured you into a false sense of security. You woke up, stretched, maybe muttered something about the weather, and convinced yourself you were going to have a normal day. The good news, you survived breakfast. The bad news, that's the healthiest you'll be all day. Because cholera in the 19th century didn't bother with subtlety. It wasn't one of those diseases that built suspense over weeks. No, cholera was the medical equivalent of being hit by a carriage moving at full speed. One moment you were upright and functioning, the next you were a crumpled moral lesson in the street. It was shockingly fast, terrifyingly fast. So fast that the phrase, well in the morning, dead by evening, wasn't a metaphor. It was the daily obituary template. Imagine this. You're going about your day, maybe carrying water, maybe scrubbing floors, maybe arguing with your neighbour over who gets the cleaner end of the shared courtyard. Then, suddenly, like someone flipping a switch inside your intestines, you're rushing for the nearest chamber pot. At first, you might think you just ate something questionable. Spoiled bread, suspicious fish, a street vendor with limited ethics. But cholera made its presence known with such violence and speed that any hope of denial vanished almost immediately. The first wave hit the stomach with the elegance of a falling brick. Vomiting, forceful, unstoppable, miserable. Then came diarrhea so sudden and so relentless it felt like your internal organs were filing for divorce. Modern medical texts politely call this profuse and watery. 19th century people called it something less polite, usually shouted across the house in panic. Doctors described the fluid loss as rice water stools, a phrase that unfortunately manages to be both medically precise and emotionally scarring. Then came dehydration. Not the casual, I should drink more water kind. This was catastrophic dehydration, the kind that collapsed your veins, shriveled your skin, and turned your pulse into an unreliable rumour. People who had been chatting normally an hour before might suddenly struggle to speak or move. Their skin grew cold and blue, their eyes sank, their hands puckered. Witnesses described victims looking as though the blood had fled from them, which medically speaking it had. Yet families saw their loved ones transform in real time. One 19th century doctor wrote that patients could lose so much fluid that the body seemed to wither. Others reported that victims felt such overwhelming thirst that they begged for water, even as their bodies rejected it violently. And in households where multiple people fell ill at once, the collapse felt like a small-scale apocalypse. One person down, then another, each within hours. Homes turned into crisis scenes. Neighbours fetched help, bucketed water, or simply waited in fear, knowing that by the time a doctor arrived, assuming you could afford one, it might already be too late. Cholera didn't care about schedules or social etiquette. It didn't wait for clergy or family or the comfort of a final word. Its speed was its weapon, and it wielded it with horrifying efficiency. People described victims slipping from the living world to the dying one in a way that felt surreal. One moment they were sitting up trying to reassure those around them. The next, they were drifting into shock, their heartbeat faint and irregular, their breath shallow. Shock wasn't just a side effect, it was the final act. The rapid fluid loss caused blood pressure to crash, organs to fail, and consciousness to fade. It was so quick that many victims barely had time to register what was happening to them. This suddenness reshaped entire communities. It trained people to fear mornings, to fear meals, to fear perfectly healthy-looking neighbours. It made ordinary routines feel like walking through a trap that only revealed itself after it had already snapped shut. And for the poor, the majority, the unpredictability was devastating. When an illness can kill you in half a day, there is no planning, no preparation, no emotional processing. Just the harsh mathematics of survival. Some lived, many didn't. What truly terrified people wasn't just that cholera killed. Many diseases killed. It was how it killed. Fast, ferocious, and seemingly without warning. A person could be reasonably healthy on Tuesday morning, and, by the time the sun dipped behind the soot-stained chimneys, already buried or wrapped in a shroud waiting for the cart. And so, cholera earned its reputation as the 19th century's silent lightning strike, an invisible force that struck without mercy, without pattern, and without giving families the dignity of time. This speed shaped everything that would come afterward. The fear, the rumours, the protective rituals, the desperate theories, the misguided cures, the door-to-door health inspections, and eventually the investigations that would finally reveal what was actually happening. But for now, the world doesn't know the truth yet. All it knows is this: you wake up fine. By nightfall, you're dead, and everyone is wondering who or what is coming for them next. The trouble with living in the 1800s wasn't just the disease trying to kill you, it was the fact that absolutely nobody could agree on how it planned to do it. In a world before germ theory, before microbes, bacteria, and anything resembling modern sanitation, people faced cholera armed with their greatest natural resource: loud, unwavering confidence built on absolutely no scientific foundation whatsoever. Science hasn't arrived yet, but opinions absolutely have. Yeah, to understand this era, imagine an entire society trying to solve a mystery while blindfolded, dizzy, and convinced they can smell the answer. Because smell, yes, smell, was the reigning medical theory of the time. The dominant belief was miasma, the idea that disease floated through the air in the form of foul vapours. If something smelled bad, it was considered dangerous. If something smelled very bad, it was basically considered a weapon of mass destruction. This led to a nationwide fear of odour so intense that it could have become a competitive sport. People avoided foggy mornings like the sky itself was plotting against them. Humidity was suspected. Mist was suspicious. A whiff of sewage meant immediate panic. Even fresh paint could raise eyebrows. And if the wind shifted in the wrong direction, where entire neighbourhoods became convinced their doom was drifting toward them, like a slow-moving ghost with personal hygiene issues. Miasma wasn't just a theory. It was an emotional worldview. People genuinely believed disease rose from the earth as toxic air, especially from swamps, cesspools, crowded alleys, and anywhere the poor happened to live. To the average person, cholera didn't come from anything as mundane as contaminated water. No, it floated majestically through the air like an invisible demon with impeccable timing. This fear of smells shaped everyday life. People stuffed rags soaked in vinegar into their noses, walked around with camphor in their pockets, and held handkerchiefs to their faces as if they were Victorian cowboys entering a saloon of death. Perfumes became emergency equipment. If someone passed a particularly pungent gutter, you could watch entire streets full of people simultaneously flinch, flee, or begin praying under their breath. And then there was the fog. Honestly, fog never stood a chance. A morning mist could send families scrambling indoors like chickens hiding from a hawk. Night air, too, was practically considered poisonous. Windows were shut tightly, turning households into warm, musty boxes where everyone slowly suffocated themselves in the name of safety. If you cracked open a window for a breeze, someone would accuse you of trying to assassinate the family. People also distrusted strangers, though to be fair, strangers distrusted everyone else just as much. Travellers were suspect, migrant workers were suspect, sailors were suspect, and anyone unfamiliar who showed up coughing was basically a human omen. Outsiders were blamed for bringing cholera into towns, even when outbreaks clearly started locally. But accuracy wasn't the point. Fear was the point. And strangers made excellent scapegoats because they couldn't argue back while running for their lives. To fight the mysterious bad air, households and cities deployed every foul-smelling countermeasure they could invent. Tar was burned in braziers, producing thick black smoke more likely to cause a headache than cure anything. Vinegar was splashed across floors and walls, transforming homes into giant salad bowls. People burned sulphur, resins, herbs, and anything else that could produce a dramatic aroma. Neighbours competed to out-fumigate each other, as if cholera would respect whichever house smelled the least appealing. The results were scenes of sensory chaos, streets fogged with smoke, houses reeking of vinegar and camphor, and families walking around sniffing like anxious bloodhounds, searching for the faintest whiff of death. If you didn't know better, you might assume Victorian cities were under attack by malevolent chefs, trying to smoke cure the entire population. All of this confusion created fertile ground for moral theories. If people weren't blaming fog or strangers, they blamed sins. Cholera was seen as divine punishment for immorality, drunkenness, laziness, or general human misbehaviour. Priests preached repentance. Moralists preached abstinence. Everyone preached something. The disease was interpreted as a cosmic scolding, a heavenly clean up your act, delivered via catastrophic dehydration. This belief had real consequences. Some people sought protection by avoiding taverns, brothels, or gambling houses, not because avoiding crowds might reduce transmission, but because they feared being on the wrong side of a cosmic report card. Others attended Mass more often, carried protective charms, or prayed fervently under the assumption that spiritual hygiene might succeed where physical hygiene clearly wasn't. And what about the actual doctors? Well, even the medical community couldn't agree. Many physicians accepted miasma wholeheartedly, while others insisted cholera was carried through personal weakness, improper habits, or a mysterious imbalance in the body's internal humours. If you were unlucky, your doctor might prescribe fresh air or exercise, which was awkward, given that fresh air was supposedly lethal and exercise made you breathe more of it. The result was a dizzying era, where every person, from priest to politician to pub owner, felt completely justified in explaining cholera with confidence. Competing theories swirled as thick as the fumigation smoke rising from the gutters. No one truly knew what was killing people, but no one seemed to have any trouble pretending they did. And that ignorance, combined with absolute certainty, created a social atmosphere as dangerous as the disease itself. People took the wrong precautions, trusted the wrong advice, and put faith in theories that had more to do with superstition and social fears than reality. This chapter of history is a reminder. Long before germ theory, societies tried to fight disease with intuition, prayer, perfume, and pure panic. And because everyone believed different things, nobody could act effectively. The air was thick with smoke, vinegar, and fear, an aromatic cocktail that achieved nothing except making the streets smell like a burnt salad being punished by God. But as strange as this era was, it sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once you believe the air wants to kill you, you begin to take extraordinary measures and make extraordinary mistakes. And cholera was just getting started. If you lived in the 1800s, you trusted water the way you trusted distant relatives at family gatherings, cautiously, politely, and with the faint suspicion it might betray you at any moment. But even that suspicion wasn't nearly strong enough. Because while families were blaming fog, foreigners, and their neighbours' questionable hygiene habits, cholera was quietly riding through the most innocent-looking substance in their homes, the water. The water looks clear, which is exactly the problem. In an age before germ theory, people didn't recognise water as a possible assassin. It was supposed to nourish you, cleanse you, boil your vegetables, and make tea slightly less miserable than life itself. Nobody stared suspiciously at a water jug the way they eyed a cloud of suspicious mist. Water was simple. Water was honest. Water was killing entire neighbourhoods. cholera spreads through feces-contaminated water, a phrase that alone can make modern readers rethink every romanticised image they've ever had of quaint village wells. But in the 19th century, this reality was both unknown and terrifyingly easy to achieve. Cities were growing, sewage was not exactly a high priority, and the communal infrastructure was a tragic masterpiece of unintended consequences. Start with the shared pumps. These were neighbourhood lifelines, the Victorian equivalent of a community resource. Except instead of offering convenience, they turned into deadly fountains the moment contamination seeped into them. Families lined up with buckets, greeting neighbours cheerfully while unknowingly passing around the microbial equivalent of a loaded weapon. One contaminated well could service dozens of homes. One infected household could poison the source, and one street's pump could sentence an entire block to a week of funerals. But water didn't only come from pumps. Wells dug into porous soil soaked up whatever the surrounding world fed them, and the surrounding world, unfortunately, was often full of things no one wanted near a drinking source. Runoff from outhouses, leaking cesspits, drainage from overcrowded courtyards, and enough human waste to make any modern sanitation worker wake up in a cold sweat. Then there were the rivers. Ah, rivers, the scenic wonders of the city, the arteries of commerce, and the unofficial waste management system for everything and everyone. Sewage flowed into rivers, factories dumped into rivers, dead animals floated in rivers, and yet people still fetched drinking water from those same rivers. Sometimes upstream, sometimes downstream, but always with a level of optimism that now feels either admirable or alarming depending on your mood. If you were unlucky enough to live near a communal privy, the risk multiplied. Many neighbourhoods had just one shared toilet for dozens of people, often constructed directly above a pit or cesspool. These cesspools overflowed, leaked, or seeped into the soil, forming a kind of subterranean disaster dripping steadily toward every nearby water source. And because people didn't yet understand bacteria, they treated privy overflow like an inconvenient odour instead of a microbial time bomb of historical proportions. This is where the true horror emerges. Cholera contamination was invisible. No smell, no colour, no taste. Nothing to compare against your neighbour's bucket. You could run your hand through it, admire its clarity, and have no idea your body was moments away from declaring a violent mutiny. At least with miasma. People felt they had warning signs, a suspicious smell here, a whiff of foul air there. But clear water, that felt unfair. Being killed by something that looked pure felt like betrayal on a poetic level. Worse still, cholera's waterborne nature made its spread look random. A whole household could fall sick while the family across the alley remained perfectly healthy. People assumed this meant divine judgment, or moral superiority, or the whims of fate. In reality, the difference might simply be that one used the communal pump while the other relied on a private well, or one family scrubbed their vegetables in contaminated water while another boiled everything into mush, or one household lived downhill from a cesspit with aspirations of escape. The randomness unsettled everyone. When a disease floats through air, at least you can see fog rolling in. When you think it comes from smells, you can try to avoid suspicious odours. But water was everywhere. It touched every pot, every wash basin, every cup, every infant's bottle. Suspicion of water required a total rewiring of the mind, and society wasn't ready for that. No one wanted to imagine that the thing they needed most was the very thing killing them. This misunderstanding shaped daily routines. People who feared bad air kept windows shut while their children drank contaminated pump water. Families who burned tar outside their houses still filled their kettles, from rivers sparkling with microscopic horrors. Entire communities performed elaborate rituals to purify the air, and didn't think twice before rinsing their plates in water, mixed with whatever the privy had leaked that week. Even the uncertainty created by this invisible danger heightened the terror. You couldn't predict which household would fall next. You couldn't smell the danger, outrun it, or pray it away. It seeped quietly into daily life, into food, into habits, into every unwashed vegetable and hastily filled bucket. Waterborne cholera was a ghost that needed no introduction and left no trace until the symptoms exploded. One contaminated source could wipe out a whole street in days. One unlucky sip could decide your fate. And because no one understood the mechanism yet, cholera looked less like a disease and more like a curse wandering randomly from home to home. It wasn't random, it was plumbing. But no one knew that. This chapter marks a turning point in the story, not because people figured the truth out yet, but because the real killer has finally entered the frame, a disease that didn't ride on the wind or punish sins or drift in from the fog, a disease that moved with every bucket, every ladle, every glass, spreading with terrifying precision through the one thing everyone assumed was safe. Cholera followed water, not people. And until someone realized that, the water would continue looking clear. Exactly the problem. On the morning of 31st August 1854, Soho was its usual chaotic, noisy, overcrowded self. Milk carts rattled across cobblestones, shopkeepers opened their shutters, and residents fetched their morning water from the Broad Street pump. The neighbourhood's beloved source of refreshment, hydration, gossip, and, as it turned out, catastrophic misfortune. The pump was free, the bill came later. No one suspected that this perfectly ordinary day would become the opening act of one of history's most devastating and famous micro-disasters. Soho was accustomed to grime, yes, but not to what was about to happen. A sudden explosion of death so intense and concentrated that later generations would study it with equal parts horror and fascination. It began quietly, one or two people falling violently ill, then a handful more. By the next morning, physicians and midwives reported cases from multiple houses around Broad Street. Within hours, the increase was unmistakable. Cholera had arrived not politely, not gradually, but like a neighbourhood-wide ambush. Residents watched as neighbours who had been bustling around just a day before were now collapsing. Over the next 3 days, the outbreak unleashed destruction with astonishing speed. Families who had thought themselves perfectly healthy were suddenly burying loved ones with barely enough time to process what was happening. One local account described people dropping so quickly that households struggled to find the strength, or the additional surviving family members, to arrange help. By the end of the first week, the panic was so severe that residents grabbed what belongings they could carry and fled the neighbourhood in whatever direction felt safest. Soho had seen its fair share of unpleasant smells, questionable sanitation, and crowded living conditions, but this was different. This felt like a force spiralling wildly out of control. Entire blocks emptied practically overnight. Those who had somewhere to go went. Those who didn't remained in the neighbourhood, turning quieter and more tragic by the hour. The numbers mounted with terrifying speed. By the time officials began formally documenting the outbreak, 616 deaths were attributed to this single event. 616 people in a compact grid of narrow streets, a death toll so concentrated that statisticians later struggled to find any historical parallel for just how tightly cholera had coiled itself around Broad Street. Even cities with thousands of deaths didn't witness this kind of neighbourhood-level intensity. What made this outbreak particularly haunting was not just the quantity of deaths, but the compressed time frame. It wasn't months. It wasn't even weeks. The neighbourhood went from functioning to decimated in a handful of days. The speed created scenes that felt almost surreal. Families who had fetched water from the pump one morning found themselves carrying bodies to wagons the next. Shops shut. Schools emptied. Taverns that normally served as the neighbourhood's social heartbeats locked their doors. Even the notoriously resilient London street vendors disappeared. One newspaper described the streets as strangely still, as if the entire neighbourhood was holding its breath. Those who stayed indoors listened for the dreaded sound of groaning or collapse from neighbouring rooms. The pump itself remained strangely cheerful-looking throughout, gleaming in the sun as though blissfully unaware of the devastation it was causing. People had trusted that pump more than they trusted many of their own relatives. Children played near it. Workers leaned against it during breaks. Mothers filled buckets from it multiple times a day. It was the neighbourhood's most reliable friend until it became the neighbourhood's executioner. The tidal wave of death forced city authorities to act fast. Physicians scrambled to make sense of what they were witnessing. Worried residents packed up carts, boarded carriages, begged relatives to take them in, or simply ran. Fleeing was not simply a strategic choice. It was a reflex born from the terrifying realization that remaining on Broad Street was becoming synonymous with awaiting your turn. The flight transformed the neighbourhood physically. Curtains were pulled shut, half-finished meals were left on tables, fresh laundry hung abandoned, doors swung open as families evacuated so quickly they didn't even bother to latch them. Entire buildings seemed to empty between morning and afternoon. The tragedy hit hardest those who couldn't leave. The elderly, the poor, the sick, and the unlucky. They stayed in a neighbourhood hollowing itself out. Their isolation, combined with the speed of the outbreak, made this episode one of the most emotionally devastating in London's already grim medical history. Officials could see the pattern. Deaths clustered around Broad Street in a near-perfect ring. The closer a household was to the pump, the more likely its occupants were to fall ill. The further one moved from the pump, the safer people seemed. It was a geographic nightmare painted in human loss. When the final tally came in, those 616 deaths, the number became more than just a statistic. It became a symbol of what unassuming daily habits can unleash when something as essential as water turns treacherous. The Broad Street outbreak remains a chilling reminder of how everyday infrastructure can collapse into tragedy before anyone realises what's happening. This was not a citywide event. This was not the work of months. This was one pump, one street, and a disaster so concentrated that it reshaped the neighbourhood's identity forever. By the time the outbreak ended, Broad Street was a ghost landscape. Empty houses, grieving families, and a pump whose handle would soon be removed in a moment that would shape the future of public health. But at this point in our story, the pump still stands, the deaths are still rising, and the mystery remains unsolved. Something in the heart of Soho is killing people at breathtaking speed, and no one yet understands why. But one thing is clear, the bill for that free water has arrived, and it's devastating. Before he became the father of epidemiology, Jon Snow was something far less glamorous. A man wandering around Soho with a notebook, a pencil, and the kind of stubborn determination usually reserved for people trying to return items without a receipt. While others debated smells, sins, and suspicious breezes, Snow used a far more radical method, asking people what actually happened. He didn't need a lab. He needed directions and patience. Picture him walking through the narrow London streets still trembling from the Broad Street disaster. Quiet houses, shuttered shops, and the lingering tension of a neighbourhood that had just lived through the medical equivalent of a lightning strike. Snow wasn't there to soothe, or preach, or speculate. He was there to count, and ask questions, and knock on doors until he had enough information to form a picture no one else could see yet. His investigation was so simple that it almost seemed naive. Go house to house, talk to survivors, talk to the families of victims, and record every detail. In the mid-19th century, this was practically a scientific revolution. Most medical men preferred theories over testimony, but Snow preferred the one thing London had in overwhelming abundance: people who had suffered through the outbreak and were willing to tell him exactly what happened. He moved from home to home, climbing narrow staircases, stepping across uneven floors, speaking with grieving parents, anxious spouses, exhausted labourers, and shell-shocked survivors. He asked who had fallen ill, who had died, what they had eaten, where their water came from, and, most importantly, which pump they used. None of this was sterile data. These were real families discussing real losses in rooms that still smelled faintly of fear. And Snow wrote it all down. Addresses, names, ages, times of death, the layout of the household, the habits of the occupants. Everything became a data point. In a time when most people assumed disease floated around like an angry cloud, Snow was quietly sketching a map of tragedy so precise that it could have doubled as a street-level crime scene diagram. The most telling pattern emerged almost immediately. The closer a household was to the Broad Street pump, the more likely its occupants were to have fallen ill. Deaths radiated from that pump like rings expanding from a stone dropped in water. Or, when he plotted his findings onto a map, the clustering was impossible to ignore. A visual argument so convincing that it made other explanations look ridiculous in comparison. One house had lost nearly the entire family. Another had only one survivor. Several lost children within hours, their small bodies quickly overwhelmed by dehydration. House after house told the same story, and Snow recorded them with the steady hand of someone who understood that behind every tally was a shattered household. But the investigation wasn't just about tragedy. It was about puzzling contradictions that sharpened Snow's thinking. Some households, just steps away from massive loss, appeared entirely untouched. Why? One family told him they never used the Broad Street pump because they disliked the taste. Another household fetched water from a different district entirely because they found the Broad Street pump inconvenient. These exceptions weren't just interesting. They were explanatory. They turned chaos into pattern. Snow noted another striking detail. Many of the worst affected homes belonged to working-class families whose daily routines revolved around fetching water from the nearest source. Children carried buckets from the pump. Mothers used its water to cook. Fathers drank from it during meals. The pump wasn't just a fixture of the street. It was a lifeline. And that lifeline, unbeknownst to everyone, had become a channel of death. His door-to-door work revealed a level of granular detail that no official record could have captured. He found out when people fetched water, how often, and for what uses. And he learned which households boiled water and which didn't. He identified how living arrangements influenced exposure. Multi-family homes crowded around a single tap were devastated. Wealthier renters with private water access often remained entirely healthy. By the time Snow finished knocking on doors, he hadn't just created a data set. He had created a biography of the outbreak itself. Each mark on his map represented a life. Each cluster pointed to a cause. Each exception strengthened his hypothesis. And most importantly, every household he visited added another piece to a puzzle that no one else had bothered to assemble. Yet what made Snow's method powerful was its humility. He didn't stride into homes waving theories. He didn't lecture grieving parents about vapours or divine punishment. He listened. He gathered their stories. And those stories, stitched together, formed a picture more accurate than anything the medical establishment had offered. His map, later famous, but at the time just pencil on paper, was the quiet triumph of his investigation. No rhetoric, no mystical explanations, no appeals to the heavens, just evidence, precise, human, heartbreaking evidence that pointed straight to a poisoned water source. Snow didn't discover the bacteria. He didn't know about microbes, but he knew the geography of misery better than anyone else. He knocked on doors until the city itself told him the truth. And once he saw that truth, it was impossible to unsee. The Broad Street pump wasn't just a water source. It was the centre of the outbreak's universe. And that universe was about to collapse. If the Broad Street outbreak had a shape, it wasn't a fog drifting over rooftops or a divine curse wandering aimlessly. It was a circle, a precise, horrifying, almost geometrically offended circle that spread outward from a single point on the map with frightening mathematical discipline. When over 500 fatal attacks were recorded within 250 yards in just 10 days, the effect was nothing short of anatomical. It was as if the neighbourhood had been dissected by an invisible compass. Step left, fine. Step right, funeral. This was not the kind of disease pattern people expected in the 1800s. If cholera floated in air, as most insisted, it should have drifted unpredictably, through alleys, over rooftops, across open squares, seeping wherever the breeze invited it, Miasma was supposed to behave like an indecisive ghost, inconsistent, moody, and unable to resist a dramatic entrance. But what appeared on Snow's expanding notes and later on his hand-drawn map wasn't moodiness, it was precision. Imagine standing at the Broad Street pump, still proudly upright at this point in the story, and drawing a circle with a radius of 250 yards. Everything inside that circle resembled a war zone. Houses on one side of a street lost entire families. Buildings the width of a doorway apart had completely different fates. One household might report multiple deaths. The next house over had none at all. The boundaries were so sharp that observers wondered whether cholera respected property lines. From the sky, as much as anyone in 1854 could imagine a bird's-eye perspective, it looked like the disease had detonated at the pump and radiated outward until its reach naturally faded, not gradually and not politely. The concentration dropped off suddenly, as if someone had drawn an invisible fence around the carnage. Even skeptics of Snow's early theories found themselves uneasy when confronted with the cold geometry of the outbreak. And that geometry grew more unsettling with each case Snow recorded. When he plotted the deaths, it became obvious. The pattern followed water distribution, not air movement. Streets that should have been equally exposed to foul smells showed radically different outcomes. Houses downwind of supposedly bad air remained untouched. Meanwhile, anyone who regularly used the Broad Street pump, no matter their age, status, or personal hygiene, fell ill with ruthless consistency. It wasn't moral weakness. It wasn't atmospheric revenge. It was a supply chain. Within those 250 yards lived workers, shopkeepers, and families with small children, lodgers, chimney sweeps, tailors, bakers, seamstresses, and servants. Many of them had little in common except their reliance on the same water source. That was enough. Cholera didn't discriminate by profession or personality. It followed plumbing and foot traffic. The abruptness of the boundary stunned not only Snow, but the few officials willing to look at the data without flinching. If miasma had been responsible, the deaths should have smeared across the map like spilled ink. Instead, they clustered like iron filings around a magnet. Inside the zone of devastation, chaos reigned. Outside it, life continued so normally it felt insulting. There were reports of people moving temporarily to lodgings barely 2 streets away, and recovering simply because the water was different. Yet others who visited Broad Street only occasionally, perhaps for a quick drink or to fill a jug, suffered sudden severe illness that seemed baffling until the pattern emerged. Once Snow pointed out the spatial relationship, it felt obvious in a way that made people uncomfortable. No one likes discovering that a catastrophe has rules. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the spatial pattern was how small the lethal radius was. 250 yards, barely a 2-minute walk. The outbreak zone was so compact that someone could stand on its edge and look across at completely unaffected homes. From a distance, the neighbourhood appeared intact. But stepping inward was like crossing an invisible border into a place where life had temporarily collapsed. Doors hung open, curtains stayed drawn. Entire buildings sat silent except for the occasional cry or the sound of someone desperately fetching water, ironically from the very pump causing the destruction. The horror deepened when Snow mapped not just where people lived, but where they died. The pattern didn't align with the flow of wind or the topography of the streets. It aligned almost perfectly with the households that drew water from the Broad Street pump. Even visitors, delivery boys, workers, children sent on errands, left ghostly footprints on the map. It didn't matter where they lived. What mattered was where they drank. The sharp boundaries made the outbreak feel almost sentient. It looked like the disease had made deliberate choices, respecting some streets and decimating others. People struggled to make sense of it. Neighbours argued, doctors debated, clergy prayed, and pamphleteers offered theories ranging from the poetic to the unhinged. But nothing explained the pattern better than the simple, horrifying truth Snow was uncovering. Cholera followed water distribution lines the way a shadow follows light. Even without identifying the microscopic killer, Snow could see its footprint. and that footprint was unnervingly tidy. The tragedy of this chapter isn't just the number, those 500 fatal attacks in 10 days, but the way the outbreak laid bare the entire neighbourhood's dependence on a single point of failure. It showed how vulnerable communities were when their most essential resource turned against them. And yet, even with such clear spatial evidence, the world still wasn't ready to accept Snow's explanation. The data was compelling, the map was terrifying, and the boundaries were undeniable, but tradition and belief were stubborn obstacles. Still, the lines were drawn, literally, a circle of death around a single pump, defying every established idea of disease and quietly whispering the truth that would soon change the course of public health. But for now, in this moment of our story, the pattern is visible only to one man with a notebook, and a city still trying to blame the air for what the water had done. In the middle of a neighbourhood collapsing from cholera, where entire streets were drowning in grief and panic, one building stood curiously calm, almost smugly so. This was the local workhouse, a place nobody ever described with positive language. Workhouses were infamous for misery, overcrowding, and meals that tasted like someone had boiled disappointment. Being sent to one was rarely considered good news, and yet, in the Broad Street outbreak, something astonishing happened. Out of 535 inmates, only 5 died of cholera. Let's put this in perspective. Outside its walls, death was sweeping through homes with terrifying speed. Families living just a few feet away were losing children, parents and neighbours within hours. Streets that normally rang with the clatter of carts and the chatter of residents had fallen eerily silent. Soho was becoming a patchwork of closed shutters and feverish households, all orbiting a pump that had turned treacherous. But inside the workhouse, life continued with a strange sort of monotonous normalcy. People woke, worked, and grumbled as usual. The routine misery went on uninterrupted. The good news? You're trapped in a workhouse. Congratulations, it just saved your life. To understand why this anomaly mattered so much, you need to imagine how baffling it looked at the time. The workhouse was close, very close, to the centre of the outbreak. It sat well within the deadly radius. It housed hundreds of people in close quarters. And historically, crowded institutions had a habit of turning mild diseases into catastrophic ones. Plagues typically adored places like workhouses. Lots of bodies, little ventilation, and absolutely no personal space. But cholera didn't seem to care. It barely touched them. When Jon Snow examined the neighbourhood, this discrepancy hit him like a flashing arrow on a map. Hundreds dead in the surrounding blocks. Whole families wiped out. A pattern so dense that the outbreak looked like a dark halo around the Broad Street pump. And right there, in the middle of it all, a massive, highly vulnerable population, almost untouched. It made no sense, which scientifically speaking made it priceless. The key, as Snow soon discovered, wasn't luck. It wasn't divine mercy. And it certainly wasn't the famously bland workhouse diet, though one could argue that if cholera truly spread through taste alone, workhouse porridge might have repelled it. No, the secret was water. The workhouse had its own private water supply, completely separate from the Broad Street pump. While the rest of the neighbourhood relied on that contaminated source, the workhouse drew its water from a different provider. The inmates weren't lining up at the pump each morning. They weren't cooking with its water, washing with it, or drinking it. They were, quite unintentionally, and shielded from the very thing that was devastating everyone else. This turned the workhouse into an enormous natural experiment, a control group no one meant to create. And it told Snow something no theory of bad air could explain. If cholera was floating around in the atmosphere like a vengeful cloud, the workhouse should have been obliterated. Crowding alone would have guaranteed that. But if cholera followed water, then the workhouse should have far fewer cases, and that is exactly what Snow found. Households on the same street suffered terribly. Lodging houses a few steps away saw half their occupants collapse. Meanwhile, the workhouse, arguably the most crowded building in the entire district, was practically untouched except for those 5 unfortunate cases. A building full of the poor, the elderly, the infirm and the vulnerable, all crammed into shared quarters, and yet it weathered the storm better than the well-fed middle-class families around it. This single fact was a turning point in Snow's investigation. Every anomaly strengthened his conclusion, but none did it as dramatically as this one. It offered undeniable evidence that the outbreak had a point of origin that the workhouse was simply not exposed to. In a city of tangled theories, curses, vapours, and moral lectures, the workhouse quietly provided the simplest, clearest demonstration that cholera's pathway wasn't floating in the air, it was flowing in the water. Even officials who were sceptical of Snow found this detail hard to ignore. They might have doubted maps. They might have clung to old beliefs about smells. But they could not rationalise how the epicentre of London's suffering could sit next to a building filled with hundreds of people and somehow miss them almost entirely. This was the kind of contradiction that cracked old theories. Snow documented it carefully, adding it to the growing body of evidence pointing toward a waterborne explanation. The workhouse wasn't just another data point. It was the cornerstone of an argument that, for the first time in the outbreak, began to look scientifically unassailable. And perhaps the strangest twist of all, the inmates inside, the very people society treated as burdens, nuisances or lost causes, were, at least in this moment, the safest individuals in Soho. The building that symbolised hardship and institutional neglect accidentally became a sanctuary, not through compassion or planning, but through plumbing. History is full of ironies, but few are as sharp as the realisation that the most dreaded address in the neighbourhood turned out to be the most fortunate one. As Snow continued piecing together the truth, the workhouse stood as silent proof that cholera didn't drift, didn't discriminate, and didn't punish sin. It followed pipes and pumps with chilling reliability, and the workhouse, by sheer infrastructural quirk, sat just outside its reach. In a neighbourhood full of bodies, grief and confusion, the workhouse that refused to die became a beacon, not of hope, perhaps, but of clarity, and that clarity would soon change everything. By early September 1854, Soho felt less like a neighbourhood and more like a battlefield, one where the enemy was invisible, the casualties uncountable, and the survivors terrified. The Broad Street pump, once the cheerful centrepiece of daily life, had become a silent suspect. Buckets no longer clattered around it. Children no longer played near it. People crossed the street to avoid even looking at it, as if eye contact alone might cause illness. The outbreak was slowing, but fear lingered like smoke after a fire. Into this landscape walked Jon Snow, armed with a stack of notes, a hand-drawn map, and the kind of conviction usually found in people who've done all the homework and know they're right. He had spent days interviewing households, tracking deaths, charting patterns, and puzzling out the logic behind the spatial catastrophe. Now it was time to present his findings to the only group with the authority to do something decisive, the Board of Guardians for the parish. The meeting took place on the 7th of September 1854, in a room where tension sat as heavily as the smell of disinfectants and desperation. The board members were exhausted, some grieving, some defensive, all confused. Theories had been argued. Blame had been passed round like a hot coal. No one wanted to make the wrong decision, but no one knew what the right one was. Snow walked them through his evidence with the calm precision of someone who trusted data more than tradition. He explained the clustering of deaths, the proximity pattern, the households that suffered and those that inexplicably did not. He described the workhouse anomaly, the high death toll within a 250-yard radius, and the interviews that had revealed exactly who drank from Broad Street and when. Then he pointed to the unavoidable conclusion. The pump was the source. The board members listened, some sceptical, some curious, some privately horrified. Snow wasn't offering a philosophical argument or a theological interpretation. He was presenting straightforward, observable facts. This wasn't about morality or fog or divine judgment. It was about a malfunctioning water supply. He later wrote of that meeting. I had an interview with the Board of Guardians of St James's Parish on the evening of Thursday the 7th September. In consequence of what I said, the handle of the pump was removed on the following day. It's such a modest sentence, so understated, so Victorian. It glosses over the enormous leap it represented, a decision to act on evidence rather than superstition, to intervene not with incense or prayer, but with a wrench. The next morning, the 8th of September 1854, a workman approached the Broad Street pump. The street was quieter than usual, a mixture of dread, grief, and weary relief. A small crowd gathered, watching with a mix of curiosity and suspicion as the men loosened the bolts. Then, with a simple tug, they removed the pump handle. There was no trumpet fanfare, no applause, no dramatic proclamation, just a limp metal lever held in a workman's hand and a pump that would never again deliver water or death. One handle, hundreds of lives, zero applause. And yet, despite the quiet, it was a moment of seismic importance. For the first time in London's cholera history, officials had removed access to a water source because of scientific reasoning. Not because it smelled bad, not because it was morally suspicious, not because of a dream or a preacher's warning, but because Dutter said it should be done. By the time the handle came off, the outbreak was already receding. The worst had passed. Many were dead, many more had fled, and the micro-epidemic had burned through the vulnerability of the neighbourhood. Some critics later pointed out that removing the handle didn't immediately save lives, and that was true, but it missed the point. The real significance wasn't the timing, it was the symbolism. The act was a public admission that cholera could be tied to specific infrastructure, that human decisions could prevent outbreaks, that water, not air, was the element demanding scrutiny. Even if the pump had somehow ceased being dangerous, the gesture cut through layers of denial and forced London to reconsider how disease actually worked. And there was another layer of irony. The pump was beloved. People mourned its loss in a small, strange way. It had been a social hub, a place of convenience, a landmark. But as the handle was carried away, even the skeptics seemed to exhale. If nothing else, it was something they could do. Action, finally, after days of helpless waiting. With the handle gone, the pump stood as a relic, still physically present, but functionally dead. Residents continued to avoid it. Children treated it as a haunted object. And Snow, having succeeded in one of the earliest acts of evidence-based public health intervention, returned to his work knowing the fight wasn't over. He still had to convince the world why the pump mattered and what the outbreak had revealed. But for now, in this moment, the pivot had been made. London had acted not on fear, but on reason. The pump had been stopped. The flow of death had been symbolically and literally interrupted. And in the quiet after the handle's removal, something profound settled over Soho. The realization that maybe, just maybe, the world didn't have to accept cholera as a mysterious curse. Maybe it could be understood. Maybe it could be prevented. Maybe, with enough evidence and enough stubbornness, a single pump handle could reshape public health. But only after someone was brave, or tired, enough to say, right, that's enough water from that pump. To understand how Britain handled cholera in 1848 to 1849, you must imagine a nation attempting public health with the enthusiasm of a troupe of actors who haven't read the script but are absolutely committed to performing it anyway. Enter the General Board of Health, an organisation assembled in the spirit of we must do something, and preferably loudly, and armed with a strategy that blended civic duty, frantic improvisation, and a deep suspicion of anyone living in a working-class neighbourhood. When cholera returned to Britain in 1848, the board had two goals. Don't let everyone die. Make it look like you're doing more than panicking. The result was an epidemic management strategy that combined earnest public health measures with a generous sprinkling of Victorian overconfidence. If modern epidemiology is a scalpel, 1849's version was a broom, swung vigorously in all directions in the hope it might achieve something. The first tool in their arsenal was house-to-house inspection, a practice that quickly became the era's signature move. Inspectors marched through crowded districts with clipboards, stern expressions, and the unstoppable confidence of people who believed cholera lurked in untidy laundry. Their mission: knock on doors, check for nuisances, and advise families on proper cleanliness, often while standing in buildings that had been designed before indoor plumbing was a concept. Working-class households usually received these visits with a mixture of resignation and irritation. Wealthier households, on the other hand, were rarely inspected at all. Disease clearly preferred the poor, according to Victorian logic, so why bother interrupting tea in Belgravia? Surveillance of the lower classes was not just a health policy, it was a hobby. Inspectors recorded everything: the number of occupants, the state of the floors, the smell of the room, the presence of damp, and any sign that the family might be enjoying life a bit too much. If an inspector knocked while you were sleeping, cooking, or grieving, too bad. When in doubt, knock louder and blame filth. Once the door-to-door lectures began, the next phase of epidemic warfare followed. Lime washing. Lime wash, a chalky mixture touted as the cure for everything from disease to gloom, was applied liberally to walls, ceilings, floors, stairwells, and occasionally the residents if they stood still too long. It didn't kill cholera, but it did make homes look chalkier and smell faintly of a failed art project. Inspectors treated lime wash like holy water, instructing families to apply it frequently, enthusiastically, and ideally in front of witnesses. Then came waste removal, a process that might sound reassuring until you remember that most 19th century waste systems consisted of cesspools, shared privies, and drainage ditches that would make a modern plumber scream. Workers hired by local boards carted away mountains of refuse, ashes, garbage, human waste, animal remains, believing that removing offensive matter would starve cholera of its favourite environment. And to be fair, it did improve street conditions. But cholera, which cared more about water contamination than the aesthetics of alleyways, barely noticed. Still, there was something admirable in the sheer determination. Night workers shovelled and scraped until the streets looked passably sanitary. Carts groaned under the weight of filth. Entire blocks smelled faintly of lime, soap, and civic desperation. For once, clean sidewalks became a patriotic symbol. Citizens were urged to tidy their houses, scrub their yards, and avoid anything that might produce a smell strong enough to make an inspector faint. Yet none of this, the knocking, the scrubbing, the carting, addressed the true source of the problem. The idea that cholera might spread through contaminated water didn't fit neatly into the era's obsession with visible mess. Air was the enemy, not plumbing. If a neighbourhood suffered high mortality, officials focused on the number of people per room, the ventilation patterns, the state of the drains, or whether the family had been sufficiently stern with their housekeeping. This meant surveillance of working-class neighbourhoods intensified dramatically. Inspectors patrolled alleys like ruddy-faced detectives searching for clues in a crime scene made of bricks and laundry lines. They took notes on overcrowded homes, decaying tenements, and any smell that hinted at the presence of humanity. They documented conditions so thoroughly that historians can now reconstruct entire districts, right down to the number of residents sharing a single bed. Some families complied out of fear or exhaustion. Others resisted seeing the visits as an intrusion by officials who showed up only during crisis. Tensions simmered, rumours spread, and all the while, cholera continued slipping through households without the slightest regard for whether they had been lime-washed in the past 48 hours. But the General Board of Health soldiered on. They believed cleanliness would repel disease, order would repel chaos, and consistency would repel panic. And if those didn't work, paperwork surely would. Reports were written, statistics gathered, committees formed, minutes recorded in meticulous handwriting that seemed almost heroic in its confidence. Despite the chaos, this period did leave an important legacy. The frantic strategies of 1848 to 1849 proved that disease required organised response, however clumsy, and that public health couldn't rely on household habits alone. Even misguided action revealed the truth the city needed to face. The living conditions of the poor were dangerously unsustainable, and no amount of lime wash could hide that forever. The board didn't yet understand cholera, but their hyperactive intervention produced something valuable, a detailed record of how the disease carved through communities. Their data, though filtered through assumptions, offered a roadmap for future breakthroughs, and their relentless inspections, equal parts earnest and intrusive, forced authorities to confront the implications of overcrowding, infrastructure decay, and the vulnerability of working-class districts. The 1848 to 1849 epidemic showed Britain what panic looked like when it dressed itself in official clothing. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't always effective, but it was energetic, determined, and foundational in a messy Victorian sort of way. Because before you can learn how to fight an enemy, sometimes you have to learn how to panic properly. There are historical moments when governments become deeply invested in the private lives of citizens, census years, wartime drafts, tax season. And then there was 1849, when Britain decided that nothing, absolutely nothing, mattered more than whether your stomach was behaving itself. In 1849, a bad stomach was a government concern. During the cholera wave of 1848 to 1849, officials believed they had finally found the secret to stopping the disease: catch it early. Not when someone collapsed, not when they turned blue from dehydration, but before the real horrors began. The magic phrase was premonitory diarrhea, a term that sounds both self-important and vaguely apologetic, as if even the wording is nervous about what follows. Nowhere did this obsession manifest more dramatically than in Bethnal Green, one of London's most overcrowded and heavily monitored districts. The numbers recorded there were so staggering that modern readers might assume they were collected by someone with a shaky grip on reality or a broken abacus. But no, the officials were very serious, very thorough, and perhaps a little too enthusiastic about recording the gastrointestinal status of tens of thousands of working-class residents. The famous statistics from Bethnal Green read like the world's bleakest medical census: 43,737 cases of premonitory diarrhea, 978 cases approaching cholera, 780 full cholera cases, 17 bodies found without any medical attendance. That's not a district report. That's a digestive apocalypse. To Victorian officials, these numbers were a goldmine of insight. To residents, it was Tuesday. The logic was simple. Too simple, as history would prove. If diarrhea came before cholera, then treating the diarrhea immediately might prevent the worst. This belief turned mild stomach upset into a full-blown public health emergency. Households were trained to report even the slightest intestinal irregularity. Inspectors arrived at doorsteps to ask questions no stranger should ever ask, and medical officers distributed advice leaflets warning that waiting even 1 hour after symptoms might invite catastrophe. Imagine living in a city where the government wants you to file a report every time you feel a little gurgle, where neighbours gossip about who rushed to the dispensary and who kept it quiet, where families hover anxiously every time someone clears their throat after dinner. It was a society one suspicious noise away from collective meltdown. Bethnal Green became the epicentre of this vigilance. The district already had a notorious reputation: overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and families packed into single rooms like unsupervised laundry. Cholera hit hard here not because the residents were morally inferior, as some Victorian commentators rudely suggested, but because the infrastructure was a disaster with windows. So when the epidemic took hold, the area essentially became a live-action spreadsheet. Inspectors, fueled by caffeine, fear, and a misplaced sense of destiny, knocked on doors with clipboards ready. They logged cases, counted symptoms, and recorded deaths with an efficiency that would make modern bureaucrats weep with admiration. The belief that premonitory diarrhea held the key to survival shaped every aspect of the epidemic response. Families were urged to seek immediate treatment at special cholera dispensaries. Physicians ordered rest, warmth, and a variety of remedies ranging from sensible hydration efforts to less sensible Victorian pharmaceuticals. Parents monitored their children for any signs of intestinal mischief, and entire households lived in fear of the first rumble. But the sheer scale of Bethnal Green's recorded cases raises a question. Did 43,737 residents genuinely experience pre-cholera symptoms? Or did the community simply become so paranoid that normal bodily functions were reclassified as early warning sirens? Given the psychological climate, the latter seems increasingly believable. When everyone is told that a stomachache might kill you, you don't take chances. Even indigestion becomes a public health event. The 978 cases labelled as approaching cholera represent a subset that frightened officials even more. These were the people who had progressed beyond mild diarrhea, but were not yet in the throes of the fatal collapse. They hovered in a grey zone between manageable illness and imminent danger. To Victorian authorities, these cases were where intervention mattered most. To the patients, it was a miserable waiting game. The 780 full cholera cases recorded in Bethnal Green tell the rest of the story. If premonitory symptoms were the neighbourhood's warning whispers, full cholera was its scream. Families endured rapid decline, neighbours rushed in with basins, blankets and prayers, and inspectors arrived to document outcomes with grim precision. And then there were the 17 bodies found dead without medical attendance. These numbers say more than any report could. They reveal the vulnerability of the very poor, the isolated, the elderly, and those living alone. They are the silent victims who slipped through the cracks, too sick or too powerless to seek aid, discovered only after the worst had already happened. But what makes this episode historically fascinating is how intensely Victorian officials focused on this early symptom strategy. They believed, with earnest determination, that if they could catch diarrhea early, they could prevent cholera deaths entirely. This belief drove dispensaries to open around the clock. It justified the intrusive household visits. It powered an entire apparatus of public health mobilisation. Ironically, though officials misunderstood the disease mechanism itself, their strategy wasn't entirely misguided. Modern medicine agrees that early hydration helps prevent the fatal shock cholera induces, but Victorian methods lacked the knowledge of waterborne transmission and were executed with the subtlety of a marching band. The legacy of the premonitory diarrhea obsession is a portrait of a society desperately trying to understand a crisis with incomplete tools. Their approach was flawed, but their effort was immense. They cared, sometimes too loudly, sometimes too forcefully, but undeniably. In Bethnal Green, early symptoms became politics, digestion became data, and in 1849, the simple act of having a stomachache turned into a civic responsibility. Because in that year, your intestines weren't just your business, they were everyone's business. If you really want to understand why cholera thrived in 19th century Britain, don't start with grand maps, medical theories, or government reports. Start with a single courtyard, 11 houses, 35 people, and one privy, a polite Victorian word for shared toilet, though shared ordeal might be more honest. In this cramped cluster of humanity, 15 people died during the cholera outbreak. That's not a statistic. That's a math lesson written in grief. And the math was brutal. When 35 people depend on one waste pit built directly into the ground, you don't need a medical degree to see where things can go wrong. But the 1800s were a time of optimism, denial, and architectural decisions made by people who clearly never had to stand in line for the thing they designed. Privacy was rare. So was survival. Let's picture this courtyard the way investigators documented it. A cramped open space hemmed in by small brick houses, laundry lines crisscrossing overhead, children running between doorways, and adults attempting to live normal lives despite conditions that made sanitation sound like an abstract rumour. In the centre or corner, a single wooden privy, worn down by use, smelling like a warning sign, and sitting above a cesspit whose contents seeped into the soil like a slow-moving disaster. This wasn't unusual. In cities growing faster than infrastructure, shared privies were the norm. They filled quickly, overflowed regularly, and leaked continuously, quietly connecting the digestive systems of entire neighbourhoods in ways too horrifying for the Victorian imagination. And yet, people accepted this as part of life, because what other choice did they have? Many families lived in one room, some shared beds, some slept in shifts. The privy was often the only part of the property that didn't require rent. But in a cholera outbreak, the privy was more than inconvenient, it was lethal. Waste pits weren't sealed, they weren't reinforced, they weren't lined with anything more scientific than wishful thinking. Liquids percolated downward into the soil that sat directly beneath homes, yards, alleys, and, most importantly, wells and water channels. You could draw water from a pump on Monday and flush waste into the ground on Tuesday, and never realise the two activities were connected in the world's most tragic plumbing loop. And in our example courtyard, this connection became a death sentence. Of the 35 people who lived there, 15 died, a mortality rate so high that it shocked even the hardened inspectors who had watched cholera tear through working-class districts. These weren't people living miles apart with different habits or different exposures. And these were families whose back doors opened into the same yard, who used the same water supply, who depended on the same privy, and whose fates were tied together more tightly than they ever realised. Victorian officials, steeped in the miasma theory, interpreted this through their own lens. Cramped living conditions, foul smells, stagnant air, and degrading habits of the poor. And yes, overcrowding contributed in its own way. But the real killer wasn't the smell rising from the privy. It was what seeped downward. Imagine stepping outside your door each morning and passing the one structure in your courtyard guaranteed to contain every neighbour's contribution to the microbial world. Imagine children playing next to it. Imagine washing vegetables in water carried from a pump only a few feet from where that same privy slowly leaked into the ground. Imagine cooking, bathing, drinking, without realising your entire daily routine followed a pipeline no one could see. This wasn't moral failure or laziness. This was infrastructure failure. Catastrophe delivered through architecture and economics. Shared waste systems created shared fate. One contaminated water source could sweep through a shared courtyard faster than gossip. Once cholera entered the household line of supply, no amount of prayer, scrubbing or vinegar rags could shield anyone inside the circle. And let's not forget the part landlords played. Many refused to pay for regular cleaning or emptying of cesspits. They viewed sanitation as a luxury, not a necessity, something for the wealthy to worry about, not for families paying rent by the week. Even when cesspits overflowed, or when the smell became so intense residents couldn't sit by their windows, pleas for repairs were ignored. Why spend money on sanitation when overcrowding was profitable? The result was a landscape where disease travelled more efficiently than information. People living in the courtyard didn't understand why cholera hit them so brutally. They hadn't done anything different from households across the alley that experienced far fewer deaths. They didn't see the invisible network beneath their feet, the quiet merging of waste and water, of habit and hazard. Victorian investigators eventually pieced together the logic. They documented the layout, counted the residents, examined the privy, and measured its distance to the nearest water sources, and concluded that the courtyard wasn't cursed. It was contaminated. Yet even with this horrifying clarity, many still clung to theories about air and morality. It was easier to blame people than plumbing, easier to criticise households for being crowded than to confront the reality that entire neighbourhoods were built on systems that guaranteed tragedy. This courtyard stands as a grim symbol of life in urban Britain before modern sanitation. It wasn't unique, it was typical. Families lived shoulder to shoulder, their health tied together by unseen infrastructure and shared burdens. When cholera arrived, it didn't distribute itself according to moral judgments or atmospheric whims. It followed the pathways carved by poverty, neglect and sewage. 15 funerals in one courtyard weren't inevitable. They were engineered, slowly, unintentionally but unmistakably, by the structures people lived within. Disease didn't choose the victims, the environment did, and in the story of cholera, few places illustrate this truth more starkly than the courtyard where privacy was rare. Space was precious, and survival, tragically, depended on what flowed beneath the ground long before anyone realised it was there. Victorian Britain was many things, industrialising, expanding, innovating, but above all it was terrified of stomach drafts. While cholera swept through cities with ruthless efficiency, the public clung desperately to the belief that danger came not from contaminated water, not from sewage creeping invisibly into pumps, but from the sinister possibility that one's abdomen might become slightly chilly. And so emerged one of the most unintentionally comedic health trends of the 19th century, the flannel cholera belt, a warm strip of fabric wrapped tightly around the stomach, beloved by households, encouraged by pamphlets, and enforced by military orders. Germs ignore fashion. Victorians did not. To understand how this woolly accessory achieved such stardom, we must return to a world still devoted to the miasma theory, the idea that disease crept into the body through cold, damp air. If cold air caused illness, then warmth surely prevented it. The logic was simple, comforting, and completely wrong. But it was also easy to market. The cholera belt was marketed as both armour and amulet, the difference between waking up alive or being discovered by the inspector. Advertisements and advice pamphlets, sold for the modest price of 2p, offered detailed instructions on how to cut, fold, fasten, and maintain one's protective flannel. These guides carried the tone of military briefings, warning that life and death hinged on whether your stomach felt pleasantly toasty. And people believed it. Fully, enthusiastically, entirely. Walk into any working-class neighbourhood during an outbreak and you'd find half the population sweating under layers of wool, miserable but convinced they were one step ahead of cholera. Mothers wrapped belts around children as if preparing them for a parade. Elderly men tied them so tightly around their middles that bending became optional. And servants stitched belts for employers. Tailors sold custom cholera belts to match fashionable coats. Winter wasn't required. Fear provided all the chill they needed. Victorians loved these belts for the same reason people throughout history loved talismans. They offered control, warm, woolly, and blissfully unaware of Vibrio cholerae. But no group embraced the cholera belt with more bureaucratic passion than the British military. The army didn't just recommend them, it issued them. Every soldier was expected to wear one, like a woolen badge of survival. Lose it, and you faced a 1 shilling fine, a significant penalty at the time. Being court-martialed for misplacing your stomach scarf was a real possibility. Military manuals described the belt as essential equipment, listed right alongside boots and bristles. Officers conducted belt inspections. Servicemen learned how to wrap them properly, how to keep them clean, and, most importantly, how not to misplace them. If the belt slipped during training, replace it immediately. If it felt loose, tighten it at once. If you hated every minute of wearing it, too bad. Health and nation depended on it. The irony, of course, was staggering. Soldiers could march through sewage, drink from contaminated wells, sleep in overcrowded barracks, and eat rations that should have been placed under quarantine themselves. But as long as their midsection was warm, medical authorities declared them fortified. Even civilian medical advice agreed. Health writers warned that failing to keep the abdomen insulated invited cholera through the pores. Pamphlets insisted that sudden chills weakened the stomach and opened pathways for disease. Families treated belts like life preservers, better itchy than dead. What makes the cholera belt phenomenon so historically delicious is how incredibly earnest it was. No one wore the belts, ironically. People didn't wink at neighbours when they tightened their woolen wraps. Fear made believers of everyone, from shopkeepers to schoolchildren to soldiers stationed overseas. The belt wasn't a joke, it was a lifestyle. But behind the humour lies a deeper truth about how people respond to crises. When the cause of a disease is unknown, the mind reaches for patterns, symbols, and rituals that offer emotional security. The belt was warm, tangible, and reassuring. Water, on the other hand, looked clean even when deadly. It's no wonder the public placed their faith in flannel rather than invisible hazards. In this sense, the cholera belt wasn't foolish. It was human. Every generation creates its own version of protective behaviour based on partial knowledge and overwhelming anxiety. For the Victorians, stomach warmth became synonymous with survival. The belts also offered something the era desperately lacked: agency. When cholera arrived, it hit suddenly and brutally. It killed swiftly, unpredictably, and often silently. Families had little control over their circumstances, and public health tools were still evolving. But wrapping a belt around your waist? That felt like action. It felt like taking a stand against an enemy no one understood. And as the outbreak surged, the sight of adults fastening wool beneath their clothing became a strange comfort. If everyone else was doing it, perhaps the belt worked. If pamphlets explained its virtues, perhaps there was science behind it. If the army fined soldiers for losing theirs, then surely this humble strip of fabric held genuine power. It didn't. But belief is its own kind of medicine. By the end of the 19th century, as waterborne transmission became widely accepted, the cholera belt quietly faded into obscurity. No scandal, no apology, no official withdrawal. It simply drifted out of fashion, leaving behind only faint outlines in military archives and the occasional dusty pamphlet reminding us how quickly fear can transform wool into a medical device. Yet the belts endure as one of history's most charming reminders that even in times of terror, humans will choose ritual over resignation, comfort over clarity, and flannel over facts. Because when the world feels dangerous and uncertain, it's far easier to warm your stomach than to rethink your plumbing. When cholera stalked a 19th century household, people responded with the one weapon they felt they still controlled: odour. If you couldn't see the disease, identify its source, or prevent its spread, you could at least drown it beneath an avalanche of strong smells. You can't see cholera, but you can definitely smell the cure. Victorian homes became battlegrounds of fumes, vapours, tinctures, and improvisation. Every family, no matter how poor or frightened, turned into a laboratory powered by desperation and questionable chemistry. If you walked down a London or Liverpool street during a cholera outbreak, you would pass houses that stank of vinegar, rooms filled with tar smoke, and kitchens where the liquor cabinet had been converted into the medical shelf. Fear drove innovation. Innovation drove scent, and scent drove everyone else to step back and give your household a respectful amount of nasal distance. First came the vinegar sponges, a wildly popular remedy for combating bad air. Households kept bowls of vinegar on tables, hung soaked cloths in windows, and positioned damp sponges near beds so their sharp tang could supposedly neutralize disease. The logic was simple. If foul smells caused illness, then strong cleansing smells must repel it. Vinegar was cheap, available, and had the added benefit of making your home smell like a pickle factory, which, in the Victorian imagination, was apparently preferable to dying. Families brandished vinegar-soaked rags like magical talismans. Mothers waved them near sick children. Fathers walked through rooms dramatically fanning the air as if conducting an invisible orchestra of domestic safety. Some people even tied vinegar pouches to their clothing, turning themselves into ambulatory salad dressings for the duration of the epidemic. But vinegar wasn't the only olfactory weapon in the Victorian arsenal. When residents wanted something stronger, something with visual flair, they turned to burning tar and pitch. This remedy transformed homes into miniature industrial zones. Buckets of tar were heated until they emitted thick, choking smoke, believed to cleanse the air of harmful influences. Entire households gathered around smouldering pots, inhaling fumes the way modern families might gather around scented candles, apart from the part where the smell resembled a shipyard on fire. neighbourhoods filled with these acrid clouds, giving streets the ambience of a naval battle reenactment. People lit tar outside their front doors, in courtyards, under staircases, even beneath windows, and if your house didn't reek of industrial adhesives, neighbours quietly judged your commitment to survival. Then there was the cherished tradition of avoiding night air, a precaution rooted in the belief that darkness somehow multiplied miasma. Once evening fell, windows slammed shut across the city. Curtains were drawn, airflow stopped. Families huddled indoors, breathing recycled air thick enough to spread its own rumours. Even during suffocating heat waves, people preferred sweating through their clothing rather than letting an ounce of night breeze contaminate their lungs. The irony was painful. While residents suffocated themselves inside sealed rooms, cholera continued flowing through water sources outside. Fresh air wasn't their enemy, but avoiding it was a moral obligation enforced through social pressure. If you cracked a window at midnight, someone would knock and ask if you had a death wish. Yet among all these aromatic defences, none was embraced with more enthusiasm than the boldest, warmest, and most recreational remedy: drinking spirits. To Victorians, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was medicine, courage, and a survival strategy rolled into one. Doctors might hesitate about doses, but the public did not. Gin was believed to strengthen the stomach. Rum was thought to fortify the nerves. Brandy was basically divine protection in liquid form. If cholera threatened your home, pouring yourself a drink wasn't indulgence. It was responsible health management. Entire families use spirits the way we use hand sanitizer, frequently, publicly, and with righteous conviction. Some advised taking a protective dram before meals. Others insisted on a steady sip throughout the day. And in pubs, where rumours spread faster than beverages, it was common wisdom that the drunk died less often than the sober, a claim with minimal scientific basis but enormous emotional value. Whether true or not, it gave ordinary people a reason to cling to a coping mechanism that made the crisis feel slightly more manageable. The reality, of course, was that none of these remedies, vinegar vapour, tar smoke, closed windows, or whiskey fortification, had any impact on cholera's actual mechanism. The disease entered quietly through contaminated water, unaffected by how much a room smelled like a pickled bonfire. But understanding was in short supply, and superstition thrives in the gaps left behind by science. And yet, these home remedies weren't just foolishness. They were acts of agency in a world where control felt impossible. You couldn't stop cholera from entering your district. You couldn't change the infrastructure beneath your home. You couldn't demand safer water or reliable sanitation. But you could light tar, soak sponges, shut windows, and pour a glass of gin with the solemnity of a medical ritual. These behaviours also strengthened community bonds. Neighbours advised one another on the proper way to hang vinegar cloths. Friends warned each other not to venture out after dusk. Households compared the sharpness of their remedies like amateur sommelier societies of urban panic. Through these rituals, people found reassurance, structure, even camaraderie. In the shadow of unseen danger, a shared smell became a shared hope. Looking back, these remedies tell us as much about Victorian psychology as about Victorian medicine. People will always reach for explanations that give them power, even if the power is imagined. They will always prefer solutions they can perform with their own hands. They will choose rituals over helplessness, smoke over silence. And so, while cholera moved quietly through the water pipes and wells, the streets filled with scents that reflected something deeper, a society trying desperately to protect itself with whatever it had, even when the real threat lay beneath the ground. In the 19th century, you couldn't see cholera, but you could absolutely smell the panic. When cholera crossed the Atlantic and arrived in the United States in 1832, it did not politely introduce itself, shake hands, and ask for directions to the nearest port. It stormed in with the subtlety of a marching band and made its way straight toward the nation's capital. Washington, D.C., still a young and unevenly developed city at the time, suddenly found itself hosting the world's most unwelcome guest. the capital of democracy, sponsored by mass graves. Americans had heard rumours of cholera's destruction in Europe, but hearing about a disaster and living through one are entirely different experiences. Newspapers tried to reassure the public. Physicians offered vague advice soaked in theory. Politicians insisted everything was under control. And then people began dying so quickly that the city's sense of normalcy collapsed almost overnight. Into this chaos steps one of the most valuable eyewitnesses of the era, Michael Shiner, a labourer at the Washington Navy Yard whose diary offers a rare, unfiltered view of life during the outbreak. Shiner wrote plainly, urgently, and without the polished restraint of official reports. He recorded what he saw, not what anyone wanted history to say happened, and what he saw was terrifying. His account of the summer of 1832 includes one of the most haunting lines from any first-hand cholera narrative. Every day they were 12 or 13 carried out to their graves a day. Not occasionally, not at the worst of it, every day. The repetition of the phrase captures something no statistic ever could. The grinding relentlessness of death. The sense that the city was being emptied one handful at a time. To visualize this period, imagine Washington not as the marble city we know today, but as a spread of muddy roads, wooden houses, half-finished federal buildings, and small, dense communities clustered around workplaces like the Navy Yard. Sanitation was inconsistent, water systems were improvised, and burial spaces, never designed for sudden population-wide mortality, began filling alarmingly fast. E. Shiner recorded the outbreak not as a distant observer, but as a man moving through a city transformed. He noted funerals occurring with such frequency that ordinary life seemed swallowed by them. Horse-drawn wagons carried the deceased to cemeteries in grim convoys. The sound of hammers building coffins became as familiar as church bells. Death stopped being an event and became a routine. The city adapted quickly, but not gracefully. Rapid burial routines became the order of the day. This wasn't out of disrespect, but out of necessity. Families had no time for wakes or extended rituals. Loved ones were often buried within hours to prevent further spread, or at least what people believed would prevent it. Gravediggers worked in shifts, cemeteries expanded. Land that had never been intended for burials suddenly acquired rows of freshly turned earth. For many ordinary residents, the fear was not just of dying, but of dying unseen. Shiner's diary mentions people collapsing suddenly, one moment alive, the next gone. Households caring for the sick often became sick themselves. Entire families vanished from city life in a matter of days, leaving empty houses that stood as grim reminders of the epidemic's reach. To understand how ordinary people processed this, imagine the psychological atmosphere. The heat of summer thick in the air, the smell of illness clinging to streets and alleyways, the distant rattle of coffin carts punctuating the day, and the knowledge that proximity to a sick neighbour or a contaminated bucket could determine your fate. The social hierarchy flattened abruptly. Rich or poor, all feared the same sudden, unstoppable collapse. Stores closed, government offices thinned out, churches overflowed with the grieving, and the swelling urgency of public fear meant that every rumour carried weight, sometimes more weight than official guidance. People whispered about where the disease struck hardest, whose street was cursed, and whether certain neighbourhoods were safer. In addition to the medical crisis, the city experienced a crisis of trust. Trust in water, in doctors, in neighbours, and in the very air itself. But one of the most striking aspects of the 1832 outbreak in Washington is how ordinary people bore witness. Shiner wasn't a physician, a politician, or a scholar. He wasn't compiling data or forming theories. He was simply writing what he saw, the daily rhythm of death, the way the city changed, and the fear that hung over everything. And in doing so, he offered something priceless, a human-scale record of catastrophe. He didn't soften the numbers. He didn't intellectualize the horror. He captured the unsettling fact that in the capital of the United States, at the very center of a young republic proud of its promise and potential, Cholera carved through the population as ruthlessly as it had in crowded European industrial cities. The epidemic faded eventually. People returned to work, markets reopened, life resumed, but nothing returned quite to the way it had been. The outbreak left scars on families, on neighbourhoods, on the collective memory of the city. And Shiner's diary ensured those scars were never forgotten. His testimony reminds us that history's major epidemics were not experienced as sweeping abstractions, but as daily, personal, devastating encounters with loss. It shows what cholera looked like from the ground level, not through sanitised reports, but through the eyes of a man watching 12 or 13 funerals pass his door every single day. In the capital of democracy, during the summer of 1832, cholera didn't just arrive. It made itself at home, and for ordinary people the only vote that mattered was whether they survived until morning. When cholera struck a community, it didn't merely attack bodies, it attacked trust. Streets that once echoed with greetings, gossip, and the familiar rhythm of daily life suddenly bristled with suspicion. People eyed each other with caution, avoided handshakes, and reconsidered the wisdom of borrowing a cup of sugar from next door. The epidemic didn't need to isolate people. Fear did that all by itself. It's not personal, it's epidemiological paranoia. In many cities across Britain and the United States, outbreaks triggered an immediate shift in social behaviour. Visitors, once welcomed with polite smiles or at least begrudging tolerance, became potential carriers of doom. Families refused to open doors to travelling salesmen, distant relatives, or even friendly neighbours who happened to knock unexpectedly. A surprise visit in cholera season wasn't charming. It was a threat assessment scenario. The paranoia had layers. The first was fear of strangers, an old instinct sharpened now by survival. Who is this person, residents wondered? Where have they been? What water did they drink? Who did they talk to? Even tradespeople, previously trusted for their reliability, found themselves greeted with suspicious glances. Milkmen, cobblers, tailors, and street vendors, all essential, all suddenly terrifying. If they came from the wrong street, business evaporated instantly. But the second layer was uglier. Fear of the poor. Victorian society already practiced a worldview where poverty was treated like a moral failing, and cholera magnified that prejudice. Working-class neighbourhoods, densely populated, poorly serviced, and struggling under the weight of harsh economic realities, suffered the worst outbreaks. Instead of addressing the structural causes, many simply concluded that the poor carried disease by nature of being poor. It was both convenient and catastrophically wrong. Across cities, people who lived near overcrowded districts avoided them like plague zones. Residents of more affluent blocks whispered that the lower classes invited illness with their habits, as if cholera cared about etiquette. Households that relied on workers from these areas sometimes fired them abruptly, claiming it was temporary, though many never rehired them. Fear mutated into stigma, and stigma into blame. Meanwhile, immigrants, already targets of suspicion for taking jobs or changing neighbourhoods, became lightning rods for disease anxieties. Irish communities faced intense prejudice during outbreaks in both Britain and America. German immigrants were accused of carrying foreign vapours. Recent arrivals from ports were scrutinised so intensely that passing through city gates could feel like crossing into hostile territory. When cholera struck New York City in the early 1830s, entire immigrant neighbourhoods were slandered as infected quarters, prompting public agitation for isolation measures. Newspapers published thinly veiled xenophobia under the guise of medical caution. Sometimes the blame travelled even further, targeting sailors, dock workers, and anyone whose occupation involved mobility. The idea that disease could arrive on a ship felt intuitive, and therefore, to many, indisputable. Then came quarantines. Formal quarantines existed mostly at ports, but informal community-driven isolation was far more widespread. Streets were barricaded by residents. Households shut themselves inside for weeks. People refused to help sick neighbours for fear of bringing illness back to their families. In some places, as entire families were sealed inside their homes, figuratively by social stigma and sometimes literally by panicked officials. Isolation wasn't gentle, it was survivalist. Parents forbade children from playing with friends across the lane. Bakers demanded customers keep their distance. Letters were fumigated before being handed off, and if someone coughed in public, crowds parted as if the person had spontaneously burst into flames. Even ordinary gestures, a shared picture, a borrowed tool, a comforting touch, became dangerous relics of pre-cholera life. What made the breakdown especially tragic was its impact on the very communities that traditionally relied on mutual support to survive hardship. Working-class families often depended on neighbours for childcare, food sharing, emergency loans, or help with illness. Cholera shattered those networks. A neighbour's misfortune suddenly represented risk, not responsibility. People whispered about which families brought it in, who had fallen sick first, who might have infected the building. Entire blocks became rumour-driven detective games, with cholera cast as the villain and residents cast as suspects. Even charity workers faced suspicion. Those who moved from house to house offering aid or supplies were often viewed with dread. Their presence on a street signalled that illness had struck, prompting doors to slam shut. In some districts, charitable visitors wore distinctive coats, so residents could avoid them from a distance, an act that unintentionally turned kindness into a visual threat. The social paranoia didn't always come from malice. Much of it was rooted in sheer uncertainty. Without understanding how cholera truly spread, people grabbed onto whatever explanation fit their fears. Outsiders, foreigners, labourers, anyone not like us. When knowledge is limited, prejudice often fills the gap. But these responses took a heavy toll. People who needed help didn't receive it. Communities fractured under pressure, and individuals who posed no danger were ostracised as if their mere presence summoned disease. In many outbreaks, the social damage outlived the medical one. The cruel irony is that cholera didn't care about any of this. It didn't follow ethnic lines, national origins, occupations, or economic classes. It followed contaminated water, nothing more. But because that truth was invisible to the people experiencing the terror firsthand, epidemics became tests of social cohesion that many communities failed. And yet, in small pockets, compassion survived. Some neighbours cared for each other despite fear. Some immigrants tended to the sick when others fled. Some working-class communities strengthened bonds rather than breaking them. Human beings can fracture under crisis, yes, but they can also surprise themselves with resilience. Still, for many districts in the 19th century, cholera's greatest trick wasn't killing quickly. It was teaching people to fear the very individuals they relied on. Epidemics rewrite social rules, and cholera's version read like this: trust no one, question everyone, and if a stranger knocks, pretend you're not home. It wasn't personal, it was epidemiological paranoia. If there was one foolproof cholera remedy in the 19th century, one treatment with a 100% success rate, it wasn't vinegar fumes, flannel belts, or enthusiastic prayer. It was running away. Putting miles between yourself and the outbreak wasn't just a preference. It was the closest thing the era had to a guaranteed cure. The cure was distance. Too bad rent was due. During the 1854 outbreak, as soon as deaths around Soho began multiplying at a terrifying pace, the neighbourhood didn't wait for scientific clarity. It responded with instinct, the same instinct used by animals sensing a forest fire. People simply left. They left quietly, quickly, chaotically, guiltily, desperately, or strategically, depending on their temperament. But the end result was the same: a massive human exodus from the streets surrounding Broad Street. For days, the neighbourhood looked like it was shedding its population in real time. One morning you might see a family on their doorstep. By evening, the shutters were drawn and the windows dark. Residents packed their belongings with frantic efficiency, stuffing clothes, candles, blankets, and whatever valuables could be carried into small trunks or sacks. Children were bundled into carts. Elderly relatives were half carried, half coaxed downstairs. Those lucky enough to have relatives outside the district sent letters or messages begging for temporary refuge. Many didn't even bother sending word. They simply showed up, knocking on doors with faces that said, "Please don't ask questions, just let us in." And it worked. Those who managed to flee early often survived, not because of luck, but because they physically removed themselves from contaminated water sources. Without knowing it, they had discovered the only intervention the city could reliably offer: relocation. But of course, fleeing wasn't available to everyone. The tragedy of cholera wasn't just its speed, it was its social clarity. It revealed with ruthless precision who had options and who didn't. The wealthy or moderately comfortable could leave within hours. They had carriages, relatives in cleaner districts, or at least enough savings to afford temporary lodging elsewhere. Middle-class families scrambled but usually succeeded in getting out before the outbreak peaked. Their houses might remain empty shells, but they themselves found safety. Meanwhile, poorer households faced the same choice but with fewer paths. Rent had to be paid weekly. Employers expected attendance. Missing work meant losing wages, which meant losing shelter. Many families lived so close to the edge that even one day without income could tip them into homelessness. Flight. For them, wasn't strategy. It was luxury. And because cholera was democratic in cruelty but selective in opportunity, the poorest suffered most. They stayed because they had to, tethered to their rooms by debt, bound to their employers by necessity, held in place by the unforgiving economics of survival. They watched neighbours flee with carts full of belongings, while they themselves stood on doorsteps holding a few coins that couldn't buy freedom. Some families tried partial flight, sending children or the elderly to distant relatives while staying behind to maintain income. Others tried to relocate just 1 or 2 streets away, believing physical distance alone, no matter how small, might save them. But if the new lodging had access to the same contaminated water supply, the escape was tragically meaningless. Those who remained experienced the outbreak at its most frightening. Empty houses created eerie silences. Shuttered windows made streets look abandoned, even in daylight. Shops closed. Schools emptied. The neighbourhood felt hollowed out, as if the city itself were recoiling from the infection. In some blocks, only a handful of families remained, watching funerals pass regularly, hearing cries from nearby rooms, and waiting for symptoms with a dread that settled deeper as each hour passed. It wasn't just illness they feared, it was being left behind. When neighbours fled, the psychological impact was immediate. If others were escaping, didn't that confirm the danger? And if they couldn't join them, didn't that confirm their vulnerability? The flight created logistical problems too. With so many residents gone, businesses shut their doors. And bakers, shopkeepers, laundresses and butchers found themselves without customers. Some fled themselves. Others stayed, surrounded by empty streets, selling provisions to the few remaining families who ventured out with reluctance and fear. The city noticed the exodus. Officials couldn't ignore the fact that entire streets seemed to depopulate overnight. And while many authorities clung to theories about air, morality and cleanliness, the sheer number of fleeing residents hinted at a truth too obvious to ignore. Location mattered. People closest to the pump left first, those further out left next. The map of human movement traced the same shape Snow's fatality map did, a widening circle around the pump. Flight became evidence, not scientific evidence, but human evidence, visceral, desperate, unmistakable. Yet for all its clarity, the mass evacuation revealed something else as well. Cholera forced people to choose between community and survival. Leaving meant abandoning neighbours. Staying meant risking everything. Some packed up quietly at dawn to avoid the shame of appearing selfish. Others departed openly, apologising as they went. And some, mostly the elderly, refused to leave at all, believing that their homes, no matter how dangerous, were the only places they could face whatever came next. There were stories of people fleeing too late, after drinking from the pump, after symptoms began. They collapsed in transit or fell ill in the homes of relatives, spreading fear wherever they arrived. Flight wasn't always clean or successful, but for those who managed to leave early enough, it was life-saving. Cholera didn't just test the immune system, it tested mobility, opportunity, and wealth. For Soho residents in 1854, survival wasn't merely a matter of luck. It was geography plus economics plus timing. The ability to evacuate, to physically remove yourself from danger, was a privilege many couldn't afford. The cure was distance. Too bad rent was due. By the late 19th century, many European cities congratulated themselves on entering a new age of sophistication. Grand boulevards, electric lighting, public parks, and the growing belief that modernity alone could shield them from the old terrors of disease. But in Hamburg in 1892, cholera returned to deliver a sharp reminder that elegance is no substitute for infrastructure. Germs don't respect commerce. Cities keep forgetting. Hamburg at the time was one of the most prosperous ports in Europe. Bustling docks, booming trade, glittering merchant wealth, and the kind of self-confidence only a thriving city can muster. It was also, unfortunately, clinging to outdated water practices with the same stubborn pride as a man insisting his collapsing roof has character. Modernization had swept across Germany, but Hamburg lagged behind in the one area that mattered most for public health: clean water. When cholera arrived, the city was entirely unprepared. Over the course of the outbreak, around 17,000 people became infected, and more than 8,600 died, a catastrophic toll that stunned contemporary observers. For a city boasting one of Europe's largest ports and a booming population, the scale of the disaster felt like a betrayal. How could a place that exported fine goods, handled global commerce, and projected such confidence fall victim to a disease associated with the worst slums of history? And the answer, tragically, was water. Again. Hamburg drew much of its supply from the Elbe River, a beautiful but heavily polluted waterway downstream from sewage and industrial runoff. While other German cities had embraced filtration systems, Hamburg authorities resisted. Filtration was expensive. Filtration required planning. Filtration threatened to slow economic expansion. And above all, filtration implied acknowledgement of risk. And risk acknowledgement was bad for business. So the city continued piping in untreated river water, as if germs could be charmed into respecting commerce. This decision proved fatal in the summer of 1892. When cholera-contaminated water entered the municipal supply, the disease spread with terrifying speed. Residents fell ill in shocking numbers: shopkeepers, factory workers, labourers, clerks, children, dockhands, servants, merchants, even officials themselves. The disease-infiltrated tenements and grand homes alike, though, as always, the poorest areas suffered the most. Panic set in. Streets emptied, schools closed, businesses shuttered, trains leaving the city filled with those who could afford escape. Meanwhile, in Hamburg's densest districts, fear mingled with resignation, as families tried to nurse the sick while knowing water, the essential stuff of life, was the very agent poisoning them. Yet what truly deepened the disaster wasn't just the pathogen, it was politics. Hamburg's leadership was fiercely proud of its autonomy. The city governed itself independently from many imperial regulations, including public health rules that had transformed cities like Berlin and Frankfurt. While other regions implemented strict sanitary laws and filtration systems shaped by burgeoning scientific discoveries, Hamburg clung to old methods out of civic pride and economic self-interest. When cholera appeared, instead of sounding the alarm, officials attempted to hide the growing crisis, terrified that news of an epidemic would scare off merchants and shipping partners. Delays in announcing the disease gave cholera a head start, time to spread unnoticed, uncontained, and unchallenged. The city's leaders weren't battling cholera. They were battling the idea that Hamburg could be associated with cholera. But reality, as it tends to, ignored their preferences. As deaths mounted and denial became impossible, the German Empire intervened. And with intervention came one of the most important scientific figures of the age, Robert Koch, already renowned for identifying the bacterium responsible for cholera a decade earlier. Koch arrived in Hamburg with a clarity the city desperately lacked. He inspected water supplies, toured affected neighbourhoods, reviewed hospital cases, and came to a conclusion so blunt it shocked the city's leadership. Standing before officials and reporters, he announced, "Gentlemen, I am of the opinion that your drinking water is to blame." It was not merely a scientific verdict, it was a public indictment. Koch pointed directly at the filtration issue. Hamburg's neighbours, he explained, had installed modern purification systems that protected them from outbreaks. Hamburg had not, and the consequences lay in its overflowing hospitals and mounting death toll. His criticism was not diplomatic. It couldn't afford to be. Thousands were dead. Thousands more would die. Someone needed to say what Hamburg had refused to acknowledge. Progress is not measured by wealth or prestige, but by pipes, drains, and filtration. With Koch's intervention, the city finally embraced modern sanitation reforms. Filtration plants were constructed. Water systems were redesigned. Public health policies were strengthened. Over time, Hamburg became one of the most improved sanitation systems in Europe, but the cost of that transformation was written in thousands of graves. The 1892 outbreak was the last major cholera epidemic in Western Europe, and it became a turning point in the global understanding of sanitation. Its lessons reached far beyond Hamburg: the dangers of political denial, the necessity of investment in infrastructure, and the irrefutable truth that clean water is not optional. It is civilization's foundation. But for the people who lived through the nightmare, those lessons came too late. They remembered the fear of drawing water from taps that had suddenly become weapons. They remembered the hearse carts making repetitive trips through quiet streets. They remembered the feeling of betrayal, trusting a city that failed to protect them. Hamburg of 1892 believed it was too modern, too prosperous, too important to fall victim to cholera. Cholera disagreed. Germs don't respect commerce. Cities keep forgetting. If cholera had a personality, it would appear ruthless, impartial, and indiscriminately cruel. But in reality, cholera played favourites. Not because it cared who you were, but because infrastructure did. Victorian society liked to tell itself that disease struck the immoral, the weak, or the unlucky. But the pattern of every major outbreak revealed a different truth. Cholera was the ultimate compliance officer for social inequality. It audited neighbourhoods mercilessly, and the poorest districts always failed the inspection. Across Britain, the United States, and Europe, cholera's heaviest toll fell on overcrowded working-class districts, where families lived in tight quarters and absolutely none of the amenities advertised by wealthy city planners ever reached. These districts were already struggling long before cholera arrived. Cramped tenements, thin walls, unreliable drains, shared privies, and water sources positioned with the architectural foresight of someone throwing darts at a map. When cholera entered these environments, it spread like flame through dry grass. Take any 19th century city map. Circle the neighbourhoods with the highest population density, the worst sanitation, and the cheapest rent. When you compare that circle with cholera mortality records, they overlap nearly perfectly. It wasn't that working-class residents were more biologically vulnerable. It was that the environment they were forced to live in was practically designed to aid cholera's travel plans. Overcrowding made the spread rapid. Single-room dwellings often housed entire families, sometimes lodgers too. Children played in courtyards shared with waste pits. Laundry lines hung above open drains. Neighbours shared water sources that, unbeknownst to them, connected their fates like a grim, invisible web. One contaminated bucket could sweep through a building, a street, or an entire block in days. Meanwhile, wealthier districts often escaped with comparatively light casualties, and not because their residents were more refined or better behaved, despite the smug narratives that circulated at the time. They survived because their water systems were separate. Many wealthy homes had private wells or access to water companies that treated or sourced water more carefully. They had space, ventilation, and indoor sanitation. They had the luxury of escape, the ability to flee outbreaks temporarily. In short, they had infrastructure that acted like a silent bodyguard. This difference in mortality fueled a powerful misconception that cholera was a poor person's disease. Newspapers, clergy, and even some medical authorities repeated the phrase, turning structural inequality into a moral judgment. If the poor died at higher rates, society assumed the cause must be their living habits, their cleanliness, or their perceived moral failings. Victorian logic operated like a badly written detective novel. Start with the conclusion, the poor are the problem, and work backwards to find evidence. Some commentators insisted the wealthy were spared because they practiced moderation and lived in healthy habits. Others claimed cholera avoided refined individuals because their bodies were less prone to depravity. Theories attributing disease to vice circulated widely, blending fear with convenient prejudice. Never mind the contaminated water pumps. Never mind the collapsing drainage systems. Never mind the landlords who refused improvements. According to polite society, the problem lay not with infrastructure, but with the people forced to use it. This narrative was so compelling to those in power because it excused them from responsibility. If cholera was a punishment for poor hygiene or weak character, then no one needed to invest in sanitation. No one needed to overhaul water systems or redesign slum housing. Instead, the burden fell on individuals: wash more, behave better, breathe less suspiciously. But the data refused to cooperate with class prejudice. Time and again, outbreaks demonstrated that cholera could devastate any community that shared contaminated water, regardless of wealth, virtue, or moral standing. Wealthy neighbourhoods that accidentally tapped into polluted supplies suffered just as brutally. The difference was that these mistakes were less common and quickly corrected because the affluent had power, influence, and resources. The poor did not. This structural disadvantage extended far beyond infrastructure. During outbreaks, wealthier families could afford doctors, nurses, laudanum mixtures, brandy fortification, in moderation of course, and early intervention. Working-class families often faced the disease alone, with minimal medical help, in buildings where even fresh air struggled to enter. And when death came, the wealthy had private burials, mourning rituals, and time for grief. The poor had rapid removals, shared graves, and little space to process tragedy before returning to work. It's important to recognise that cholera didn't actually select victims based on class, but class determined exposure, and exposure determined death. The disease didn't care who you were, infrastructure did, and infrastructure in the 19th century served some people far better than others. Even within poor neighbourhoods, inequality determined survival. Households on higher floors with better ventilation sometimes fared slightly better than those in damp ground rooms. Streets with a functioning drain fared better than those where waste pooled under floorboards. Water drawn early in the morning before contamination spread might be safer than water drawn later. Small differences, meaningless in wealthier areas, became lifelines for the poor. Cholera, in this way, became a brutal examiner of society. It revealed not only where people lived, but how they were allowed to live. It exposed the logic of cities built for prosperity, while quietly neglecting the reality of the workers who powered that prosperity. It showed that health wasn't an individual trait, but a community condition. By the late 19th century, reformers used cholera mortality data as ammunition in calls for sanitation reform. Maps displaying death rates alongside income levels made the correlation impossible to ignore. Public health began shifting from blaming individuals to holding governments accountable. The disease forced cities to confront what activists had long argued: inequality kills. Cholera's class test wasn't a written exam. It was a map of mortality, a story told in wells and privies, a ledger of neighbourhoods denied the infrastructure necessary for survival. And its most damning lesson endures. Diseases may be biological, but their victims are often chosen by society long before the first symptom appears. When cholera entered a community, it didn't just take lives, it took time. Time to mourn, time to gather, time to say goodbye. It erased the rituals that made death bearable, replacing them with speed, fear, and a grim efficiency that stripped humanity from the final hours of a person's story. The ceremony was brief. The fear was permanent. In many 19th century cities, the normal rhythm of death involved layers of tradition: washing and preparing the body, gathering family, inviting neighbours, holding wakes that lasted through the night, and conducting funerals filled with prayers, songs, whispered memories, and slow processions to the cemetery. These practices helped families accept loss and reinforced community bonds. They turned grief into something shared. But cholera shattered this rhythm. Because the disease killed quickly, families often barely had time to realise a loved one was sick before they were faced with arranging a burial. Yet the same swiftness that made cholera so terrifying also made the rituals surrounding death feel rushed and incomplete. When someone died of cholera, the clock started ticking immediately, not for ceremony, but for removal. Medical officers, inspectors, and undertakers insisted that bodies be taken away quickly to avoid contagion, moral danger, or, most commonly cited, panic. Whether it was in London, New York, Hamburg, or any crowded working-class district, the response was similar: keep the dead out of sight. And so began the era of rapid burials. In some cities, families had as little as 2 to 4 hours before officials arrived to take the body. There was no time for proper preparation, no time for extended family to travel, no time to gather neighbours who would normally come to support the grieving household. Its bodies were wrapped hurriedly, often by strangers wearing whatever protective gear they could muster: aprons, kerchiefs, sometimes just a determined expression. The absence of ritual was devastating. Death stopped feeling like a passage. It felt like an administrative task. Worse still, cemeteries quickly overflowed. During intense outbreaks, the numbers were staggering. Grave diggers, overwhelmed and understaffed, exhausted themselves digging long trenches where coffins could be lowered one after another. In some districts, coffins were stacked several layers deep, separated by thin layers of earth. Families who arrived later in the day saw graves already half-filled, workers moving with the mechanical rhythm of people trying not to think too hard about what they were doing. Funeral processions shrank. Instead of extended families following a horse-drawn hearse through the streets, a single cart might carry several coffins at once. The name of the deceased became secondary to the urgency of disposing bodies before the next wave arrived. Clergy performed abbreviated rites, sometimes reciting prayers for multiple people in a single ceremony. In the worst outbreaks, some cemeteries suspended individual ceremonies entirely, and the emotional toll, enormous. Parents often weren't allowed to hold their children one last time. Spouses couldn't kiss foreheads, arrange hair, or sit beside the body. Siblings who had grown up sharing a bed weren't allowed to share one final moment. The familiar rituals that had comforted generations vanished under the pressure of disease control. In some working-class neighbourhoods, officials even removed bodies before sunrise, believing early removal minimised hysteria. Imagine waking up to find the bed empty, a small note left behind, and knowing your loved one was already gone, physically and symbolically, without your participation. Fear replaced closure. Silence replaced mourning. Despite this, families tried desperately to reclaim fragments of ritual. Some carved small symbols on hastily purchased coffins. Others kept locks of hair, a cherished Victorian practice intensified by the impossibility of physical farewell. A few risked reprimand by sneaking into cemeteries at night to stand near fresh mounds. Grief found cracks to slip through, even when the system tried to seal them. And while poorer families endured these rushed burials most acutely, wealthier households were not entirely spared. Even if they had private plots or family tombs, the citywide panic meant servants, undertakers and clergy were overwhelmed. The disease did not respect a household's desire for dignity. Even prominent families found ceremonies shortened, attendance discouraged, and burial times dictated more by officials than by custom. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of cholera-era burials was the loss of communal memory. When so many coffins were stacked together, individual identities blurred. Names weren't recorded carefully. Grave markers, if they existed at all, were often temporary or inaccurate. Families who visited months or years later discovered empty fields, reorganized plots, or forgotten trenches where dozens rested anonymously. Without rituals, grief became internalized. Without processions, loss became invisible. Without stories, remembrance faded faster than it should have. In some cities, the psychological scars of these disrupted burials lasted longer than the epidemic itself. Communities struggled to articulate their sorrow when the usual language of mourning had been stripped away. What does a funeral mean when it lasts 90 seconds? How do you honour someone who disappeared before you could say goodbye? How do you heal when your last memory is the sound of a coffin being rushed down a staircase? Cholera didn't simply break bodies. It broke the time-honoured contract between the living and the dead. And yet, even in this bleakness, humans resisted erasure. They whispered names when officials weren't listening. They held miniature memorials inside cramped kitchens. They told stories at candlelit tables long after the epidemic passed. Rituals, though interrupted, adapted quietly. But the overarching truth remained. During cholera outbreaks, death became logistical, not ceremonial. Efficiency replaced empathy. Fear replaced farewell. The ceremony was brief. The fear was permanent. If you fell sick with cholera in the 19th century, the first thing you needed was luck. The second thing you needed, if luck failed, was a doctor. Unfortunately, luck and doctors often operated on opposite principles. Physicians meant well, unquestionably. They worked tirelessly, showed up at all hours, and risked their own health. But when it came to cholera, even the best-trained medical minds were often performing an elaborate guessing game, with high stakes and low success rates. Before rehydration therapy, IV fluids, electrolyte replacement, or even a correct understanding of the disease, doctors were essentially battling a biochemical firestorm with a medicine cabinet full of Victorian creativity. The treatment might kill you, but so might waiting. To understand why medical care looked the way it did, imagine the world doctors lived in. There were no microbes yet, not officially. Germ theory was still controversial. Many practitioners believed diseases resulted from imbalances of bodily humours, poisoned air, nervous shocks, chills of the stomach, divine displeasure, or invisible atmospheric disturbances. Cholera, with its sudden collapse and dramatic symptoms, seemed to confirm every superstition. It was too fast, too violent, too mysterious. So treatments reflected this uncertainty. The standard medical toolkit in the early to mid-1800s included remedies that would make a modern pharmacist faint. Doctors used opium, bleeding, calomel, mustard plasters, brandy, camphor, aromatic spirits, tobacco enemas, blistering agents, laudanum, and hot bricks wrapped in flannel. You could go into a doctor's office for diarrhea and come out wrapped like a roasted chestnut, half sedated, half dehydrated, and entirely unconvinced you'd chosen the right profession to trust. Opium, in pills, tinctures, or laudanum, was one of the most common cholera treatments. It slowed bowel movements and eased pain, which made sense if you didn't know dehydration was the real killer. A person who stopped purging might look calmer, but inside their body was still losing fluid faster than it could compensate. Opium masked symptoms beautifully. It saved lives rarely. Then there was bleeding, the old standby for every medical emergency from fever to heartbreak. Doctors wielded lancets with confidence, assuring patients that removing a pint or two of blood would relieve internal congestion. In practice, this meant taking a person already experiencing catastrophic fluid loss and draining them further. A few practitioners eventually noticed that the patients they bled were not surviving at inspiring rates. Others insisted the bleeding had been attempted too late, too early, or with insufficient enthusiasm. Calomel, mercury chloride, a substance we now classify comfortably under "please don't eat that," was another favourite. Physicians believed it stimulated the liver and purged impurities. Calomel did indeed purge something. Entire digestive tracts. It caused vomiting, diarrhea, salivation, and neurological symptoms. But because cholera already caused those things naturally, doctors often assumed the medicine was working. When desperate, they reached for escalation. More calomel, larger doses, faster administration. If it didn't work, the disease was blamed, not the poison. Heat-based therapies were also popular. Doctors encouraged mustard poultices across the stomach, hot bricks on the feet, warm baths, hot flannels, heated sandbags, anything to raise body temperature and reactivate internal vitality. Patients often suffered burns, rashes, and additional misery. But because cholera left the skin cold and the pulse faint, these efforts seemed intuitively logical. Unfortunately, cholera did not care about Victorian intuition. Even alcohol returned as a respectable remedy once it passed through the doctor's hands. Many physicians insisted that brandy revived the pulse. It encouraged internal warmth and restored balance. Patients were given shots at regular intervals until they either improved or stopped complaining. To this day, some family diaries from cholera years read like cocktail menus with footnotes of despair. All of this reflected a deeper truth. Doctors were honest enough to know they were confused. Medical journals from the era include extraordinary admissions, professionals openly acknowledging that cholera defied treatment, challenged expectations, and humbled expertise. And many described the disease as baffling, mysterious, unprecedented, or a phenomenon outside the usual boundaries of pathology. Hospital reports often read like autopsies of medical confidence. Every method employed proved ineffectual. Symptoms advanced despite intervention. Treatments alleviated suffering but did not alter outcome. Successes were rare and likely due to the patient's constitution. Even the great innovators of the time struggled. There was no consensus, no standard protocol. Some insisted cholera was a gastrointestinal illness. Others argued it was neurological. Some believed the disease originated in the atmosphere. Others believed it settled in the bowels. Medical conferences became chaotic debates featuring proud declarations, heated disagreements, and the occasional hint of mutiny. Meanwhile, patients lay in beds, or on floors, or on makeshift pallets, surrounded by buckets, blankets, and relatives doing their best to comfort them. Doctors visited rapidly, moving from home to home. They tried remedies, changed strategies, revised theories, scribbled notes, and returned hours later only to find patients far worse, or gone. When treatments seemed to work, they recorded them. When treatments failed, and most did, they adjusted their explanations rather than their tools. But despite all of this, it is impossible to dismiss these doctors as careless or ignorant. They were operating at the edge of known science, confronting a disease that broke every rule. They saw the speed of collapse, the dehydration that defied measurement, the blue skin, the near-lifeless pulse, and they did what humans do when confronted with the unknown. They reached for the tools they knew, hoping one might be enough. They sat with families. They held children. They documented patterns. They learned painfully, slowly, and often too late. Many themselves died from exhaustion, exposure, or infection, acquired in the homes they bravely entered. Cholera exposed the limits of medicine. It humbled the profession. And in doing so, it laid the groundwork for change. Only after decades of failure did doctors finally embrace new theories: microbes, waterborne transmission, and most importantly rehydration as the cornerstone of treatment. But in the 19th century, before science caught up, seeking medical help for cholera was a gamble. Doctors might save you, or they might give you mercury, bleed you, heat you, sedate you, wrap you, scrub you, or bless you with a remedy passed down from someone's ambitious uncle. The treatment might kill you, but so might waiting. Cholera was a catastrophe for the 19th century, but it was also the greatest urban planning consultant no city ever wanted. Long after the disease retreated, its impact remained carved into pipes, pumps, policies, and the bureaucratic machinery that now shapes modern public health. Cholera came and went. The disease left. The paperwork stayed. Before cholera, cities grew like enthusiastic teenagers, fast, messy, disorganized, and convinced nothing bad would happen simply because it hadn't happened yet. Streets expanded without drainage, houses were built before water mains, and waste disposal often involved gravity, hope, and a convenient ditch. But cholera exposed, as brutally and repeatedly, that cities could not survive on improvisation. Infrastructure wasn't decorative, it was life support, and so cholera, more than any royal decree or political speech, forced cities to evolve. Sewers, the uncelebrated heroes of civilization. No single innovation represents cholera's legacy more dramatically than the modern sewer system. Before mid-century reformers intervened, most cities relied on cesspools, surface drains, open ditches, and the occasional drainage tunnel constructed during a moment of municipal ambition. Cholera made the consequences of this painfully clear. In London, after outbreaks in 1832, 1849, 1854, and the Great Stink of 1858, where engineer Sir Joseph Bazalgette oversaw the creation of a massive underground sewer network, an engineering marvel that diverted waste away from crowded districts and into treatment systems miles downstream. His pipes were so overbuilt, intentionally, that they still function today. Cities across Europe and America copied the model. Hamburg, Paris, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, each built increasingly complex sewer systems, not because citizens suddenly developed hygienic enthusiasm, but because disease forced their hand. Cholera didn't care if a city had museums, theatres, or grand boulevards. It cared whether waste stayed out of drinking water. And from the late 19th century onward, sewer construction became a symbol of a city's modernity and its survival. Water filtration, from optional to mandatory, if sewers were the defensive strategy, or water filtration was the offensive one. For decades, cities resisted filtration due to cost, politics, or denial, but cholera showed, repeatedly, emphatically, that untreated water was the single greatest threat to urban life. That realization transformed filtration from a luxury into a necessity. Slow sand filtration became widely adopted in the 1870s to 1890s. Cities like London, Berlin, and Amsterdam led early adoption. After the catastrophic 1892 Hamburg outbreak, filtration became mandatory across the German Empire. American cities followed, with places like Louisville and Lawrence leading breakthroughs in filtration effectiveness. Suddenly, engineers were heroes. Water inspectors gained job security. Filtration plants appeared on skylines with the same civic pride normally reserved for monuments. Now, clean water became a right, not a privilege. Public health bureaucracy, the birth of modern prevention. Before cholera, public health was a vague concept typically handled by whichever city official had the fewest pressing duties. There was little coordination, few legal powers, and almost no infrastructure for long-term planning. After cholera, entire bureaucracies sprang into being. Cities, nations, and eventually international bodies created institutions dedicated to preventing disease, monitoring outbreaks, and enforcing sanitation regulations. Among the legacies, local health boards gained authority to inspect housing, regulate waste disposal, and mandate improvements. National public health bodies formed to track diseases, compile statistics, and coordinate responses. Quarantine laws were standardized. Mortality data became systematically recorded. International sanitary conferences emerged, precursors to the World Health Organization. In other words, cholera invented paperwork as a public health weapon. Cities now had health inspectors, sanitary engineers, epidemiologists and clerks whose jobs existed entirely to prevent the next outbreak. And once those offices were created, they were never emptied again. The irony. Cholera outbreaks eventually declined dramatically, but the bureaucratic machinery created to fight it kept expanding, and thank goodness it did. Urban planning, the silent revolution. Cholera forced people to confront a radical truth. The design of cities determines who lives and who dies. This realization reshaped urban planning. Wider streets improved airflow and reduced overcrowding. Green spaces were added to create healthier environments. Building codes emerged requiring proper ventilation and access to clean water. Tenement reform movements pushed landlords to provide basic sanitation facilities. Housing departments arose to regulate slum dwellings. Cholera, without meaning to, became an architectural critic. Entire neighborhoods, dense, dark, unventilated and unsanitary, were deemed unfit for human habitation. Cities learned that you couldn't simply build up, you had to build safely. Scientific legacy, data, maps, and the birth of epidemiology. Cholera outbreaks in the 19th century provided the world with unprecedented data sets. Mapping deaths became routine after Jon Snow's pioneering work. Physicians learned to track disease by place, not just by symptoms. Statistics became tools of persuasion in political battles over sanitation. Cities began requiring autopsies, case reports, and systematic mortality registers. Before cholera, science reacted. After cholera, science investigated. This shift laid the foundation for modern epidemiology, one of cholera's most lasting contributions, the long shadow of reform. By the early 20th century, cholera had largely vanished from Western cities, not through luck, but through concrete, expensive, architectural changes. Sewers, filtration, regulation, data collection, public health offices, the invisible infrastructure that now keeps millions alive every day. It's easy to forget that nearly every modern convenience, from flushing toilets to clean tap water, was built atop the graves of thousands who died before these systems existed. Cholera forced cities to choose reform or perish, and once they chose reform, the disease receded, but the systems stayed, growing more complex with every passing decade. Cholera may no longer haunt Western streets, but its ghost lives inside every drain, every water main, every public health memo, and every bureaucratic form stamped urgent. The disease left. The paperwork stayed. For many people living in the 21st century, cholera feels like a ghost, something safely boxed into the past, alongside powdered wigs, horse-drawn hearses, and the belief that flannel belts could outsmart microbes. After all, we have clean tap water, sewage systems, and hydration salts. Surely cholera has retired, moved to a remote island, and taken up fishing? It hasn't. If anything, cholera is the historical figure who refuses to leave the stage even after its exit line. History didn't end. It just got cleaner water. Despite massive advances in sanitation and medicine, cholera remains endemic in large parts of the world. According to World Health Organization, over 6,000 deaths were reported globally in 2024, with outbreaks affecting around 60 countries across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and parts of the Americas. And those are just the confirmed cases. The real numbers are likely far higher due to underreporting, conflict zones, and areas without sufficient health surveillance. Cholera never vanished. It simply became more selective about where it thrives. The geography of vulnerability, modern cholera behaves exactly like its 19th century ancestor. It follows water. Where sanitation breaks down, where pipes crack, where systems fail, cholera steps in with all the enthusiasm of a microscopic opportunist. The disease tends to flourish in places facing natural disasters, which disrupt water infrastructure refugee displacement, where people crowd into temporary camps, urban slums, where clean water is scarce, conflict zones, where sanitation collapses entirely, climate-driven floods, which mix sewage with drinking water. The same conditions that plagued 19th century London now plague 21st century hotspots in Yemen, Haiti, Malawi, Somalia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Cholera's global footprint hasn't shrunk, it's simply moved. If the Victorian era taught us anything, it's this. Cholera doesn't care about borders, it cares about infrastructure. Modern outbreaks, fast, fierce, and familiar. When cholera strikes today, the pattern resembles the past more closely than most people realise. In 2022 to 2024, outbreaks surged dramatically worldwide. WHO reported over 600,000 cases, confirmed and suspected, more than 6,000 deaths, 60+ affected countries, many facing repeated waves. Climate change has become cholera's new accomplice. Warmer waters support bacterial growth. Heavier rains overwhelm sanitation systems. In some regions, droughts force communities to use unsafe sources. Cholera thrives anywhere the environment becomes unstable. If Jon Snow were alive today, he wouldn't be walking door to door in London. He'd be using GIS surveillance in Port-au-Prince or Aden. But he'd recognise the story immediately. The good news, we finally have tools that work. Unlike 19th century doctors armed with laudanum and optimism, modern medicine actually understands cholera. Today's primary weapons include 1. Oral rehydration therapy, ORT, the simplest, cheapest, and most life-saving treatment in medical history. ORT alone can reduce mortality from over 50% to under 1%. 2. IV fluids, used for cases where dehydration becomes severe too quickly for oral treatment. 3. Antibiotics, not always necessary, but helpful in severe cases to reduce disease duration. 4. Vaccination oral cholera vaccines, OCVs, such as Dukoral and Chancol, can help protect vulnerable populations, especially during outbreaks. 5. Rapid diagnostics. Modern labs can confirm cholera in hours, not the days or weeks of guesswork seen in the 1800s. But none of these tools matter if clean water is unavailable. No amount of ORS packets can compensate for an entire city drinking contaminated water daily. Why cholera persists, the infrastructure gap. The fundamental truth: cholera still exists today for the same reason it existed 200 years ago. Not everyone has access to clean water. Roughly 2 billion people still drink water contaminated with fecal matter. Around 3.5 billion lack safely managed sanitation systems. Urban slums grow faster than cities can build infrastructure. Conflicts destroy the very pipelines meant to protect civilians. Climate instability introduces new vulnerabilities every year. Cholera is not a medical failure. It is a civil engineering failure. Whenever a government invests in water systems, cholera declines. Whenever war, corruption, or poverty erode those systems, cholera resurges. Western countries didn't eliminate cholera with medical miracles, they eliminated it with plumbing. A global warning in microbial form, every modern outbreak is a reminder of what happens when sanitation is treated as optional. Cholera is not a nostalgic disease that politely remained in Dickens' lifetime. It is a global indicator species for where the 19th century still lingers. Want to know which regions lack stable infrastructure? Which governments are under strain? Which populations have been pushed to the margins? Look for cholera. It will point the way. The disease is a diagnostic tool for inequality. Governance failure and environmental stress. When cholera explodes in a region, it tells the world something fundamental. This place has been left behind. A future without cholera? Absolutely possible. Unlike many infectious diseases, cholera is fully preventable with existing technologies. Clean water, sanitation systems, and basic hygiene can eliminate it from any region. Some countries have already done it. Others are on the path. Eradication is not a fantasy. It's a budget item. WHO's strategy aims to reduce cholera deaths by 90% by 2030. The roadmap is clear. Strengthen water and sanitation infrastructure, deploy vaccines during active outbreaks, improve surveillance support, fragile states during crises, educate communities about safe water handling. We know exactly how to end cholera. What we lack is the global will to invest consistently where the need is greatest. Cholera's modern reality, a disease of the past. For people in wealthy nations, cholera feels gone. For millions of others, cholera is a recurring visitor, a seasonal menace, a predictable killer, a reminder that history is not a linear march forward. History didn't end. It just got cleaner water, and until all countries do, cholera isn't going anywhere. If cholera taught the 19th century anything, it was this. Comfort is not the same thing as safety. But Victorians, bless their optimism, clung to the idea that a clean parlour, polished boots, and well-aired drapes provided better protection than pipes, drains, or evidence. If comfort saved you, Victorian London would have been immortal. Before cholera, cleanliness was a visual concept. A tidy household was a moral household. A fragrant room was a healthy room. A respectable neighbourhood, wide streets, trimmed hedges, orderly buildings, was automatically assumed to be disease-proof. No one questioned whether the water was contaminated, the drains poorly designed, or the nearby river quietly acting as a petri dish. Appearances were everything. Cholera shattered that illusion. The disease tore through communities with such precision that it exposed the limits of visual judgment. Streets that looked pleasant were sometimes fed by the same tainted water mains as the poorest alleys. Houses with velvet curtains could be located just upstream or downstream from sewage outlets. Families with immaculate sitting rooms still boiled water that had travelled through pipes lined with sediments no one wanted to think about. The truth, learned the hardest possible way, was that cleanliness meant nothing if the water wasn't. And here's where the era's most painful irony emerged. The poorest communities learned this truth first. They didn't have the luxury of believing appearances kept them safe. They knew that the smell of a drain didn't tell the whole story, that a clear bucket of water could hide danger, that the fine-looking public pump could deliver death. Their neighbourhoods were the early warning system, an unfair, involuntary and devastating one. When cholera arrived in overcrowded districts, it struck so brutally and predictably that these places became the testing grounds for what the wealthy didn't want to learn. Infrastructure matters more than intention. A family could scrub floors daily, hang vinegar cloths in every window, polish brass until it shone, and still lose 3 children in 1 week if their water source ran through contaminated soil. Meanwhile, a wealthy household could step over garbage on the street, argue about perfume over breakfast, and remain untouched simply because their water came from a private well or a different supplier. In other words, virtue, tidiness, and self-respect had absolutely no impact on whether the bacteria entered your body. Victorian society naturally resisted this conclusion. It preferred moral explanations, aesthetic reasoning, and the comforting myth that danger could be recognised on sight. Respectable families clung to the belief that their refinement insulated them. Reformers blamed slum dwellers for spreading disease, not realising that slum dwellers were simply the first victims of the infrastructure that wealthy districts also relied upon, but without as much buffer. Cholera did not respect furniture. It did not admire wallpaper. It did not care that your breakfast room captured the morning light beautifully. If your water was contaminated, you were in danger, no matter how elegantly you lived. The myth of safety through comfort became increasingly impossible to defend as the century progressed. When outbreaks occasionally struck wealthy districts, sometimes through accidental contamination, sometimes through shared water mains, the shock was enormous. Suddenly the disease wasn't a societal judgment, it was a plumbing issue. These moments hit the privileged world like a slap of cold water. A mansion could have marble floors and a contaminated cistern. A boarding school could maintain impeccable discipline and lose dozens of pupils to tainted wells. A military garrison, with uniforms pressed and buttons gleaming, could fall victim because the water barrels hadn't been cleaned properly. This wasn't the universe making moral commentary. This was biology making infrastructure commentary. And nowhere was this lesson clearer than in places that upgraded their water systems early. When filtration, sewage diversion, and protected reservoirs were installed, cholera often vanished, even if the neighbourhood still looked grimy by Victorian aesthetic standards. Meanwhile, pristine-looking suburbs with outdated infrastructure remained vulnerable. By the late 1800s, the myth finally cracked. Cities were forced, sometimes by data, sometimes by disaster, to admit that safety required investments in things no one could see. Underground pipes, filtration beds, sewers engineered with the calm precision of someone who had recently witnessed a cholera ward. Public health officials began repeating a radical idea. It doesn't matter how your home looks, it matters how your water moves. The lesson spread slowly, and resisted at every turn by people who preferred upholstery to epidemiology. But cholera was relentless, and its message unavoidable. Even today, the myth persists in gentler forms. Some travellers avoid dirty-looking streets while sipping drinks made with unsafe ice. Some communities assume they are protected because their neighbourhoods appear tidy, even while their plumbing systems decay quietly underground. Modern outbreaks still remind the world that a clear glass of water is not the same as a safe one. The Victorian belief that comfort equals safety has proved stubborn, but cholera hammered home the truth. You cannot smell sanitation. You cannot see microbes. You cannot decorate your way out of contamination. And the communities who suffered most, the poor, the overcrowded, the ignored, were the ones who learned first and paid most for a lesson the world still occasionally forgets. If comfort truly saved, the Victorian upper classes would have lived forever. But as cholera taught us, it's not the sofa that matters, it's the sewer beneath it. The story of cholera is, in the end, the story of a world transformed, but only after ordinary people suffered more than their share. Cholera was history's harshest teacher, and its lessons were written in panic, improvisation, tragedy, and, eventually, progress. Throughout the 19th century, cholera acted like a merciless inspector, walking through cities and households with a clipboard, checking boxes no one wanted checked. Contaminated water supply, checked overcrowded housing, checked failing infrastructure, checked officials unsure whether to panic or pretend everything was fine. Checked. Every outbreak was a brutally honest assessment of how societies functioned at their weakest points. Long before laboratory tests, before microscopes confirmed what Jon Snow suspected, before international health regulations, cholera revealed, over and over, that survival wasn't about virtue or cleanliness, or even good behaviour. It was about infrastructure, geography, and sheer luck. If you happened to live near a safe well, you survived. If your neighbourhood was slightly uphill from sewage, you survived. If you fled early enough, drank from a different pump, or avoided a contaminated bucket by coincidence, you survived. Not exactly a comforting survival strategy. For the majority of people, those living in cramped tenements, those working jobs they couldn't abandon, those without private water or country homes, survival was more complicated. It required navigating a landscape where danger was invisible, explanations were inconsistent, and authorities were often wrong with full confidence. Cholera didn't just kill, it exposed. It exposed inequality, It exposed political denial. It exposed the fragility of cities built too fast and maintained too little. It exposed the belief that bad smells cause disease, while perfectly clear water quietly carried death from household to household. Worse still, cholera revealed just how improvisational public health truly was. Victorian officials responded with moralising suspicion, tar-burning, vinegar sponges, pamphlets, door-to-door inspections, quarantine measures that sometimes made sense and sometimes made everything worse, and theories that collided loudly in newspapers and medical journals. Meanwhile, ordinary people were left to figure out the rest. Protect children, comfort relatives, guess which sources of water were safe, and decide whether to stay or flee with whatever they could carry. And yet, paradoxically, this relentless suffering forced the world to change. Cholera reshaped cities which redesigned themselves to separate waste from water governments, which created permanent health boards and inspectors' medicine, which learned to track disease by data, not by smell engineering, which became the front line of prevention daily life, which gradually adopted concepts of sanitation we now take for granted in this way. A cholera became the unlikely architect of the modern world. Sewage systems didn't appear because leaders suddenly cared about public comfort. They appeared because cholera demanded it. Water filtration wasn't implemented because cities enjoyed spending money. It was built because thousands died when they didn't. Public health departments weren't created because politicians enjoyed paperwork and statistics. They emerged from the simple realization that ignoring disease was more expensive and more fatal than preventing it. But for all these long-term victories, the human cost was monstrous. Every improvement came after communities were devastated, after neighborhoods grieved, after families buried loved ones without ritual, after children watched siblings collapse within hours. Progress always arrived late. The good news for the future was built upon the bad news of the present. Cholera forced governments to act only after disaster. It was ordinary people, dock workers, labourers, seamstresses, maids, factory hands, street vendors who experienced the brutality firsthand. They endured the uncertainty, the rushed burials, the medical experiments, the misinformation, the suspicion, and the impossible choices. Their suffering became the data that shaped reforms. History books often credit engineers, doctors, and reformers, but the true cost was paid by the very communities whose names rarely made it into official reports except as tallies. In that sense, cholera's final legacy is not technological or scientific. It is human. Because cholera didn't just transform infrastructure, it transformed empathy. It forced societies to confront the reality that safety must be collective, not individual, that disease anywhere can become disease everywhere, that water connecting one household to another also connects their fates. This was the uncomfortable truth Victorians avoided until the evidence overwhelmed them, and it remains true today. Modern outbreaks continue in places where infrastructure fails, where inequality persists, where political will collapses, where crises disrupt sanitation. Clean water is still a privilege for far too many. Cholera never cared about social class, but infrastructure always did. Cholera never singled people out, but conditions did. Cholera never decided who deserved to live, but access did. And so the world finally learned survival is not merely a personal achievement, but a structural one. In the end, the paradox of cholera is this: it killed countless people, but saved millions in the centuries that followed through the reforms it forced. It exposed the worst failures of cities, but inspired some of their greatest innovations. It destroyed communities, but strengthened the systems meant to protect future generations. The good news? You survived cholera. The bad news? That's how everybody else finally learned how not to die.